Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have a complete treat. Jockin and Econ are completely delightful. I love both of their work. I've learned so much from them. I could talk with them for days, and I am absolutely thrilled to have them together in the same conversation. Both of them are tremendous thinkers. Econ just put out a video that was so elegant and overwhelmingly crisp in its presentation, and there were so many word plays. I'm going to be referencing it for a very long time on understanding, reverence versus management and the history of conservatism and how it's kind of just not really conservative anymore because it's just a management mentality in disguise. I really love how I put that. And Mr. Jockin's Substacks are always events. I think the topics that he's covering are of the utmost importance. And on this fine evening, we're going to start by asking Mr. Jockin a question. He has a really great Substack on terms of service brutalism, which just rolls off the tongue so nicely. And I think it's a really important topic. And hey, Jockin, what do you mean? What do you mean by terms of service brutalism? What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Econ and Daniel, always enjoyed talking to both of you. So, terms of service brutalism is a play on words. First on brutalism, so it's a movement in architecture where generally 1950s to 1970s, around this time period, 70s is actually more where really we see it more, where the ideology of modernity related to architecture kind of comes to, one can make an argument, it's perfection or totalization in the sense of the creation of spaces with the purification of geometry, and especially with the use of concrete as this material that could be shaped and produced into any arrangement in any way possible, where the clarity and smoothness of the geometry of space can be expressed in a way that modernist architecture was desiring and wishing on. And especially with the removal of any kind of, it's almost, in this term, it's derogatory. It has a kind of derogatory stance, brutalism, in the sense that the human subjects that are in these spaces is a secondary consideration. It is simply the geometric arrangements of space and light that is the priority of these architectural designs. Um, and typically, the human persons, if considered at all, is meant to be treated in the relationship of the sublime, in the sense that the sublimity of the kind of alienation of the human person in these spaces. It typically also correlates with, not necessarily with it, but parallel with urban planning of Robert Moses and other modernist thought, where how basically the lived space were machines of living, and the flows of human age objects through economic transactions of moving through suburban spaces into urban centers, and then from urban centers back into the suburban spaces, with kind of this kind of totalization of planning of the human life in a complete sense. But the thing is, and that's, these were parallel paths that kind of overlapped to some degree. What that was based when we talk about architectural brutalism, this is what we're pointing to, is these kind of two overlapping ideas of intentional planning of the human person in a totality of telos, of intentionality, usually by economic vectors as the main priority concern, paired with a visual temporal perspective of space, where the perfection of these spaces is via geometric clarity and materiality that has a priority of removal of history as a main emphasis area. The terms of service part is to say, while these architectural spaces of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s have been oriented around the physical space, the digital apparatus space of user interfaces, and this both in the digital space and the interfacing with that with the physical space, is a parallel passing through. Terms of service means kind of these apps have usually a normative standard of terms of service in terms of your relationship to use this access to this product or interaction. You must agree to these terms of service. It is inherently by the idea as a kind of a showing of agreement to consent to play to interact with this space. But almost always these terms of service are always structured and arranged to the benefit of the originator of the space, not the persons in the space. And what typically happens is you go through this space, and this is now the next part, as opposed to architectural space where you walk into it, you have direct access to the effect onto you. So the sublimity is directly affronting to you, and you sense it and experience it. In terms of service brutalism, and now to say the smoothness of user interfaces with their arrangements and protocols and trajectories, we consent with and we work with as we go through our days. And generally it's invisible to us. We're not aware of the arrangements and the protocols that we are set under by using these apps and applications and experiences of life. However, the sublimity of those events occur when there's an error. When some error or some breakage occurs, the terms of service ruptures against the subject. And even worse, it actually has the same experiential quality as if you're entering into an architectural space, a physical space. I give examples of it. It typically shows up when there's a breakage in the expected protocol. So an example I used an app to pay for parking. And when I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, I was going at a conference. I paid for the parking. I used the app to pay for it, prepay for it. I go to my parking spot. I am in the right spot. I go to the conference. I come back. I get not just one booted, I get double booted. So both my wheels are booted. I get the sticker stamp on the side of the car. I'm supposedly parked illegally or not correct. I violated the terms of service of this parking space. And this is the consequences. And now this is the point of the kind of terms of service brutalism sublimity is when I go, wait, this is an error. I paid. I have the rational evidence to show I did pay. The humans, I try to contact them. No humans are available for 2 to 3 business days. This is a Saturday. So I'm host. There's nothing for me to do but to do the adjustments as they need to, which I have to pay the fee. And then after the fact, make my recourse. And the whole time it's like, well, no one can help you. This is just the terms. There's no one to help you when the failure occurs. It's only a retroactive humans multiple steps later can, and it was with no fanfare and no protocol. And there's lots of examples on the net. We talk about this. It typically happens whenever there's an abstractional operation. And then when the failures occur because the particularities or where error shows up, this is from Aristotle, this whole point of justice versus equity, when there's a difference of an error, when the universal law gets applied to particular circumstances, there's a difference, thus an error. If there's no human persons to adjudicate the difference, then it's just the logic. It's perfectly rational. This result occur, and there's no recourse. And that kind of sublimity of the error encounter of it, and that there's no recourse directly available to you. This is what terms of service brutalism is pointing to. So it's a play on this original architectural term in physical space, and now it's talking about how the digital spaces we operate in and habituate us with their expectations and norms and guardrails. They shape us and inform us to be certain kinds of persons that we don't really realize what's going on until there's an error, until there's some breakage of what we were trying to do, what our operations are, and the error that reveals from that. And in that sublimity, we realize, oh, this has been going on this whole time. So that's the summarization of what the article talks about.
No, it makes me think about time with hotels.com, where something goes entirely wrong and you try to reach someone and it's no person to reach. You get a machine, it goes on, and it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's fault though, because there's no person there, and you start to think, did I do something wrong? Because you kind of take on responsibility. The whole thing is kind of a lot of fun. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. I think also what's very interesting, because in your article, there's this idea of, because I think it came up at the net and you talk about it very well, that there's this distinction between freedom and choice, actually, and that there's this assumption that if people are able to make more choices, that they will therefore be more free. And there's this kind of sense, and I'd be curious if you agree with this, and then I'll invite Econ to talk about his video and also how he may see it relates to this, because the video he did, I just think is so important. So freedom in this framework, quoting from your paper, is not primarily a matter of formation or judgment, but of access and selection. So if you have more access and selection, you're freer. And there's some sort of sense that if you have to deal with people, that gets in the way of your choice. Perhaps because you have to negotiate what is possible, you have to figure out how they think. And there's kind of this idea that a machine will just make it smooth and clean. You'll just have your options in front of you and you'll feel freer because you don't have to deal with people. Because, Aren't there times where you rather not talk with a person, just kind of go through the grocery line and not have to make conversation? Aren't there times where you rather just kind of pass along, right? Yeah, well, you may say that until you end up in a situation where all you can get is a machine and you've got the IRS on you and you can't reach any agent and you're being accused of something and you're in a Kafka novel or something like that, right? And what ultimately also there's this kind of assumption is that the more we open up access and selection, and there's a certain way that it's assumed that technology in these apps somehow open access and selection. They create new things, new ways to park, new ways to get access to a hotel. And it gives you a lot of information about all the different hotel options precisely by removing human agents that you may have to call to get that information. It's now all available to you. So you can make the choice. But yeah, it feels smooth and nice until there's an error. And there seems to be this kind of belief that one day there won't be errors anymore. Okay, we're so sorry about the booting, but once we get really good at these applications and these AI, then that won't happen anymore, right? That one day we'll take care of that. But of course, that can bring with it the problem of a certain having to perhaps flatten life, so that there is less unexpected things that can occur that can generate those errors, which can bring with it all sorts of different problems. And I suppose the thing I would just ask you first, Jockin, and then I'll pass it to Econ. What is the relation here? Why is it that it is a mistake to believe that freedom is not just a matter of access and selection, but has something to do with formation or judgment? And why is it that terms of service brutalism get in the way of freedom as such?
Well, those are good points. I mean, I've been talking about this concept for a long time. It was actually our discussion in the net about freedom and choice and their ontological the collapsing of them and how that's an error ontologically that motivated me to finally write about it. Also, to supplement this is a discussion I have with Johannes from Halcyon Guild on friction. So the ideology of friction. The practice of design is meant to remove friction. So that's basically what our discourse is about. When we talk with one another, we're trying to mitigate and to remove friction. And the reason why is because we want to increase the velocity of satisfaction of desire. So thus to connect this with this point of really to basically choice and freedom with desire. So the whole point is that logically, if we maximize the possibility space and remove the limitations of the satisfaction of those options by desire, so desire is able to be satiated or desired basically through a multiplicity of options, that is a kind of presentation of what freedom is. But the problem is, from a classical point of view, is that that's not what freedom is. And partly because one typical response is to say the problem is when desire actually constrains choices, actually. Meaning you get controlled by your desires. There's that angle of discussion. But the other aspect, I think, as I talk about in the article, is the choices in which one makes is given a kind of possibility. So it's not about having just a maximum amount of quantity of choices. It's about the decision making and the prioritization of those choices and the kind of valuation of those choices. So these are the things that, by terms of service brutalism, it's basically removing the quality of judgment and memory. But typically what the terms of service brutalism does, it obliterates memory and judgment. People, you're not meant to think. What their protocol is, by removing friction, is to stop thought. It wants to make subjects who do not think and remove the space between apprehension and judgment, or quite frankly, just completely bypass judgment, or move it as small a space as possible from the judgment to the action. So the apprehension to the action, the space between that where judgment is meant to apply, is meant to be the design activity of ideology of design. With terms of brutalism is to bring it closer and closer and closer together as much as possible. So that'd be a kind of synopsis about why this terms of service brutalism, it confronts one of the problems with a collapsing of total maximalization of choices, is what freedom is, when that's actually not what freedom is. Freedom is actually the power of memory to strike through to recall what actually matters. So in the space between apprehension and action, that space between is actually where freedom is found. Not in, you have this gigantic portfolio of optionality, and the freedom is just maximizing that and removing limitations from the vectors of good to satisfy that desire. That's the summary note.
I think that's lovely. It's interesting. I'm thinking now Paul Virilio's speed, this kind of idea that there's this sort of acceleration that defines modern life. And if things slow down, then that allows, say, the citizenship to think and learn what's going on. So you have the perpetual crisis. And I know Owen and Joshua Hansen will talk well on Paul Virilio, and he's fascinating. I'm also thinking of the movie Brazil, where, people are destroyed by paperwork. That's the end of the world because there's so much paperwork. And it's interesting as well. And then I'll throw it to Econ to talk about anything that you just said, but also to talk about his video, because I think it's just very relevant here. There's this interesting way where freedom, under this paradigm, freedom equals no inconvenience. Nothing is an inconvenience to you, right? And there's this weird way in which the expansion of choice almost suggests if we expand choice enough, you'll never have to make a choice that feels like a trade-off or settling for less, or it will entail inconvenience. Like if we can expand choice enough, there will always appear a choice eventually that entails basically no friction. That's one option. Or you can have the option where things move so quickly that you find yourself making a choice, in a sense, very fast, and then simultaneously owning that choice is what you wanted to do. Like that it actually, in the selection of it, entails a certain rationalization that actually requires a sort of flattening of how you consider your choices or what you want to do to kind of make your wants and desires basically predictable or simpler so that it fits into whatever choices are on offer, right? Because if I can make what you want simple, per se, or less dynamic, then I don't need judgment. Right. And it becomes more, it feels good, therefore it's good. Right. You have that kind of direction in the direction of pleasure. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, just to build on that, this is another concept called interpretability. These spaces need to be able to make data interpretable. So yes, so that's exactly what happens. Basically, if you have a domain space of consideration that's not legible to the entity or other entities, then yeah, it will be compressed. It's information compression. So yes, so that's the point. So like you having your particularity needs to be synthesized through or interpolated through the logic or schemas that are interpretable to as broad of a range as possible. So I just want to build on this point.
Well, that makes me think of Econ's wonderful work. There's this idea that you're allowed to be particular in so much as you're not too particular, right? You can be particular in so much as it doesn't disturb the smoothness of the system or start forcing people to judge difference, right? Like there's an interesting way in which it's okay to express your particularity in so much as if it's within the preset logic of, say, terms of surface brutalism, or to the degree that it fits into, say, the logic of the market or the logic of the political discourse, right? And then if we can actually begin to identify ourselves with that expression of ourselves to ourselves, then we as our own mental process becomes smooth to ourselves. And at that one, we're kind of enclosed and damned, right? Because we've actually come to identify with the flattening, and then we just kind of get pulled along with the smoothness. And there's a very unfortunate way where the system seems to be training us into the habits of, in fact, doing that. So in that way, in those moments when they boot both of your tires, there's a sort of grace there, because you see through the veil, don't you, Mr. Jockin? You see through how this is not sustainable to the human person. And so in the break, there's a grace, right? But Econ, I would love you to say anything, any thoughts on terms of service brutalism or anything, rabbits, carrot juice, anything at all. Or on this, anything. Say the word anything. That's actually hilarious. You can say anything, but nothing else. Only the word anything. Econ, great to have you, sir.
Hey, I just want to say thank you to both of you. I love talking to both of you. This is always a fantastic piece. And I want to point something out. This is the hardest thing in the world to do, is to sit down with people and having these deep conversations, only because there's so much that just got said by you and Jockin that I feel like I want to talk about it and unpack it for like another 5 hours.
Yeah.
But we have to worry about word economy. And that's so horrible and yet so great, right? It's wonderful in that you stress yourself, but it's also bad because you're like, oh, I feel so alive. And that's every time that I have these conversations with yourself and Jock. And so I'm going to actually go backwards before I jump into my video, because what y'all are talking about right here in this frictionless space of choice, this is actually what got me to become a Christian. Lo and behold, I was working with a famous economist and we were putting together a model of choice theory that would answer the problem of preference treatment in economics. Now, we were going to use Jungian archetypes to actually argue for why choices aren't the problem of nihilism. Now, this is crazy because economics has a problem of nihilism, which we have to deal with by having the axiom of revealed preferences. So how this connects anyway. So you go into a grocery store and there's 1,000 different types of cereal. How do you choose which cereal? If you don't even have a preference, you can't start at a position to put yourself into reducing the choice to a level of complexity for choice. So what does a frictionless society end up doing with choices? Well, it leads to infinite regress because you don't have a first principle of choice. And so if you don't have a first principle of choice, you end up in nihilism and you die because you're hungry because you couldn't figure out which one of the cereals you were going to eat. So your body has to actually force you to eat something. So you are entirely autonomous at this point. You just grab the first box and eat it. If you like it, you like it. And if you don't, you don't. But at that point, you're not really in it for taste. You're driven entirely by instinct. Now, why does this matter when we're talking about this? Now, the last time I was on here, I was talking about nudges and about what they do to choices, right? And the first thing and the main goal of me pointing out was that judgment is necessary for choices. If you lack judgment, you lack salvation, because man, his primary ability is discernment. And this is based off the Gnostic chapters of Saint Diodocus of Photiki. He points out this whole thing. Why did Adam fall? Well, he was tricked. Well, why was he tricked? Because he lacked discernment. Like, yeah, there was pride and all of these things, but these things are given in our environment. But we have discernment that allows us to understand and act and see the moral and ethical value of good versus evil. And because of this ability to discern and judge, that's the works that we do that we are, almost entirely judged on, right? That's why in the scriptures it says you will be judged by your knowledge. That's the point, because that's what's going on. And it goes back to what he was talking about on habits. Now, so again, no judgment, no salvation. Now, moving back a little bit more, why this matters in the context of nudges. So as y'all have just expressed, you've laid out this perfect explanation. We're moving to a frictionless choice society. Again, a frictionless choice society is nihilism. And so people can't act. And so what do nudges do? They add the ability of an agent to get the principal to act without the principal having to choose. So because we live in the frictionless nihilism, somebody goes, oh, I've already chose for you. So you don't actually have to waste your cognitive ability on it. And this just leads into people becoming animals, right? When we lack our discernment, when we lack our ability to cognize, when we lack our understanding of the noetic field, we just become animals. Because what separates me from another beast is simply that I can think, act, and live in both a cognitive and a noetic plus an embodied structure. And like that's what we end up getting, right? And it's everything that you're pointing out. That's the point of brutalism. And I do want to point something out again, back on this idea of more choices does not equal more freedom. This is connected to the video, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But Jockin, your work here on brutalism, I never put it together. Look, I don't know too much about architecture, but I do know urban planning. And the moment you connected it to urban planning, I got slapped in the face because I didn't connect it to what you were talking about. But hey, one of my favorite economists is this lady, Jane Jacobs. Now, Jane Jacobs wrote like a really big attack on like modern city planning, right? This urban planning problem, right? And this is something that me and Rose talked about the last time as well, about this lack of love, this lack of living, the vitality of a city. You know, if we make everything perfect, it's the most efficient, it's the best it could ever be. It's this managerial mindset. It lacks the reverence that you can have for the city. It lacks love, it lacks worship. And so what you end up with is just this flat surface that's geometrically perfect, but content wise is empty and broken and soulless, right? Like millennial gray houses. Like you can see my room, it's yellow. I could have gone with millennial gray. I would rather die. Okay. No, I want some color, some pop. I need to be surrounded by my friends and life and love and living. It just has to be. If you just live in a box of gray in a world of frictionless choice, in a world of everything is efficient, like what do you even have at that point? You're an animal, you're entirely autonomous, and people think, well, oh, I'll have more time because it's more efficient, that I can spend reading books. Right. Okay, well, fine. Go read a book. Go read, you know, Dostoevsky. It's not going to make a lick of sense. It doesn't matter. You have no way to match the content of the message. You're just lost. You're just there. It's just a book at that point. It doesn't hit you. There's no feeling, there's no content, there's no meaning. It's useless. And this is why I think, you know, Jockin's work on this terms of service brutalism, it's so easily connected with my work against nudges. Like it's almost one and the same. Now, we will end up having a fight on this idea of pariasis, because I definitely want to unpack this with him. And he was talking about it because he had a really good conversation with someone, and I was actually thinking about this from the cybernetics perspective. But before we get to that, just to give a brief connection to all of this and why my last video, I guess, is important. It's this understanding of, are modern right-wing Republicans conservative? No, not even in the slightest bit. You know, the neocon lacks anything that would be connected to conservatism, right? Like they have new conservatism, as if that's not already a paradox. And then what is it? What tradition is being conserved? It's the hierarchies. Oh, well, that's the idea. Oh, we conserve the hierarchy. Why are you conserving the hierarchy? Because we have a managerial mindset that we use to control the systems of power or the systems of relations or whatever system you want to have it, right? But it's always this dynamic interaction. And what it lacks in actual dynamism is simply that it doesn't hold anything as a first principle. There's no first principle. I've never seen so many people Bible thump without ever reading a Bible in my life until you go to a Republican convention. You know, many of the liberals that I talk to, they at least read the Bible, even though they disagree with it or hate it or whatever. At least they read it. But what you often see is this faux religiosity, these words like patriot, love of country. I love God. I love country. They're slogans, but they lack meaning. They lack anything that's real, that's sensible and intelligible to the human spirit. And so what I laid out was that as long as we live in a Republican system, but I mean, Republicans, not a Republican system. Let me say, as long as we live under the Republican rule, where everything is driven by the managerial elite, what you will eventually have to consistently deal with is that the status quo is the only thing that's ever defended, and once the status quo moves, it just gets redefended. That's why there's this joke that modern Republicans are nothing but 1990s Democrats. but they lack anything substantial that holds what a conservative actually is. And that is holding these things such as reverence, worship, the higher order understanding. And, one of my biggest inspirations to this is Russell Kirk. I've spent a lot of time reading his work. It's phenomenal. I think everyone should read it. Russell Kirk, he dominated those intellectual debates with the Chicago school. He dominated against the Messians, the Austrians, and it's simply because they would create arguments, which, by the way, I have a video on this. They would create arguments for relativism, right? And he would lay out an argument for why relativism doesn't work. And it's simply because, no one can judge my choice because at the time of my choice, it's open in the air, right? It's just a probability space. And once I make that choice, but in reality, tradition judges you. Tradition is a higher order that tells you, no, you shouldn't. And this all leads into a little bit more, but I think that's a good overview of everything.
You mentioned Russell Kirk. God bless you. His day is coming. Oh my gosh, it's actually extraordinary. But you see, the problem is, again, and I think we mentioned at the net, we take these terms like conservative or liberal, and I'll throw it to Jockin here, and we have this one meaning. No, there was a giant debate at the genesis of these things on what we're even talking about, and now you have Nick Land and Dugan and all of that throwing out liberalism, which don't get me wrong, by what we understand liberalism to be, which is this frictionless thing that Jockin is talking about, yeah, that's really problematic. But there is a debate at the root of that argument, an understanding of classical liberalism that must be recovered, because Russell Kirk absolutely understands that you cannot outsource the question of moral judgment to the market or assume it. I mean, a line from Jockin's paper that I think captures a lot here. The operational liberalism, so what we're talking about as it's become, treats freedom as sufficiently realized through the protection and expansion of individual choices, regardless of the ends toward which the choice is directed. Yeah, and you hear that. But guess what? It's the same mistake that I've talked about happens in economics. There's an assumption that people know what their ends are. There's an assumption that people have ends. There's an assumption, it's like Marx begins well, people want things. Well, where does the demand come from? There's a stimulation of demand, but how do people come to demand something, right? And basically you go, yeah, well, they have bodies and they don't want to die. Okay, yeah, when their stomach gets hungry, that will push them out of the birdie and donkey problem and they will eat something. But how are you going to deal with the problem of hikimorism or isolationism or seeking the beautiful or so? You once I can be alone in my apartment and just order all the food that I want without interacting with people, then the social and the communal will fall apart. And if there's something about the human person that can only be realized in communal relations, that's very problematic. A way we put it is like what has happened is basically now people think that freedom equals choice. If you have choice, you are free. But actually, freedom does not equal choice. You have to find freedom in choice, which requires judgment and discernment. In something you choose, because the moment you choose something, you've actually limited yourself, right? Because you've chosen X instead of Y. So choice always limits freedom, actually. In the sense of it reduces options. And if you think freedom equals choice, you're now in a forever kind of problematic self-effacing contradiction that will basically lead to mental illness or having to basically squash the human person where you don't notice this contradiction, which means you have to flatten dynamicism, flatten your, if you don't feel free in choice, well, it's your problem. That's like the pharmaceutical, then you need to get treated. There's something wrong with you. Right? As opposed to actually your inability to find freedom in the idea that it equals choice is evidence that the paradigm is wrong, dang it. Because you need to find freedom in choice, but that requires discernment. And basically, I would just also add, in a frictionless world, you're going to lose the ability to care. Because you develop care in that Heideggerian sense from obstacle, from difficulty. And so even if the world is frictionless and you have no more problems and it's utopia, you won't care. You'll have a utopia you don't care about, which sounds like hell. But let me throw it to Jockin here. Mr. Jockin.
Well, I mean, this is why I love these conversations, because then people start talking and you're having insights upon insights. It's so much fun. Love this stuff. Okay. I mean, so Economy had a little debate about this on the Discord about this point, but I'm going to bring it in and out here again and re-articulate one more time. I think the argument of memory and spirit has a lot of value in this because of the argument of tradition, in the sense that a tradition is a memory in culture that is, again, as I heard Econ just talk about, it's actually a grounding of the choice, or choices are within the context of a tradition. And actually, the biggest problem I think we have, like, the reason why I can't even label myself in the political discourse is because we lost memory of what we're even talking about. What is the human person? What are we doing here? Why are we doing what we're doing? What is the good life? Like, what is a human person? These things, I find no satisfactory answer on either political discourse in America. Because it's taken for granted. But it just is, as Econ is saying, these names with no soul have no spirit. There's nothing through them. There is no activity. There is no logi. There is nothing there. It is simply a name. And thus, when these terms are used, they have no force behind them. They have no essence behind them at all. And we need that kind of, and I think and I think Econ's essay is really important because the biggest problem of operational liberalism and managerial spaces, it consumes value. It consumes spirit. It eats it up. The surplus, tradition is a surplus. That excessive surplus that we live on, we rely on. And what happens is, as we kind of self-consume with this wrong account, we're destroying ourselves culturally. And the end conclusion is a nihilistic impasse where you don't even know what to operate on. You have nothing to direct your orientation because the foundations of our culture and tradition that oriented our actions has been destroyed, has been consumed and decayed and removed. So we don't even know what freedom is, or let alone what is the good life. How should we live our lives? What is it to love? What does love even mean? Thus, this is actually why Plato's projects of asking the questions, what is X? Or shout outs to Daniel and Michelle with Philosophizing Your Life, asking what is salt is actually an activity of trying to draw out the principles. And the reason why it's become so important, and actually one can make an argument of why is in the political context of Plato writing those dialogues, or at least the presentation of Socrates in that environment, it was a culture in crisis. It was a culture in crisis. Greek was in crisis at that time. So as a result, the kind of requirement of philosophy in spaces of crisis is to ask questions because of the original principles, archives that oriented activity are being destabilized. They're not there. They're emptied out, and they need to be re-articulated, revivified, basically, through the philosophical process of questioning and consideration and drawing forth to consideration what these terms mean, what the orientations are about, and then the political process is drawn out from that. I think, and especially I say that because what we generally found out was when we confuse form for place. This is part of my more recent essay series. I'm working on them now. I think that the operationalization of space via geometry, where we, based on what is the known prefigured, what we think account of what is the human person, what is our lives as machine is living, for example, with urban planning. What happens is when we make efficient spaces based on that definition of what a human person is and what is the human activity, this is the end result. You get these brutalistic spaces where no one is there beside, like in the downtowns, for example, and a lot of these spaces have been designed like this. It's not living. They're only there because people have to work there. And then as soon as they have to get done with work, everyone's gone. They're ghost towns. There is no soul. There's no activity. They're just a carcass. That's just by the compel. And that's the thing, is that then that requires capital and then positions of capital to force people into those spaces to do the activity. And as soon as that force is gone, everything empties out. The great question is, this is actually, the difference of that and religious spaces, for example, is that isn't interesting. You don't have to be paid to show up there. Isn't that interesting? I just bring that. I think that's worth pointing out. What are the spaces where money must be used to inject people having to go through these spaces versus this? You want to be in that space for its own sake or for other reasons. beauty also in terms of architectural spaces also has that quality. Some places people want to be there because it's just beautiful, or places that are there because of the relationship to religion, for example. But I'm just drawing out these points. And so thus the problem, one more time to summarize this point, when the obsession of geometric space by place with the inscribed empirical observation, what we think to compress the definition of what is a human, what does it mean to live as economic transaction, creates certain kinds of spaces. Versus the whole point, why is a schema not a morphe, nor even an eidos? Just use the Greek terms. Like, why does that matter? It matters because those are not living. A schema is not living. The life of things is with morphes and eidos. And that is one of the distinctions. That while it is true, all morphes are schemas, like they can be, they are embodied, and thus geometry can be implied to them. This is true. The reverse is not necessarily the case. And that's why I'm drawing out. So the human person is a soul with a living activity that in the activity, in the intelligence of in noia, by the way. I mean, but Aristotle's pointing to anima about this is very powerful. What is a body? A body is the intelligentsia in noia, the inactivity in nous. It's both. It's this really fun interplay. That's what a body is, which is super interesting. What that means is, what I'm getting at here is, it's so in the intelligentsia means the in telos, activated, enacted, right? But with enoia, with the in nous of the what is this substance and presented in front of you. So in the human person, which is communal, by the way, so it's not just an individual human being, it's in the family and the political and all the other spaces. To simply say the human person is to be economic agent, to go into a space to produce economic activity of capital, and then to go back home and have leisure time to then consume. That schematic geometry gives you a certain kind of space dynamic and relationship that is, as we're seeing, is not the whole human being, because it had a wrong ontology from the very beginning. Versus the religious man is much closer to what is the human person in a much clearer way. I only say that because you don't need economic imperative to have activity of human persons in those spaces. Now, am I saying that's the only way to answer this question? No, I'm simply drawing out that is the case. Like, and I'm using that heuristic of where do we see human activity in the human kind of commune, or the human activity in fullness show up that doesn't have this destruction, this kind of decaying self-annihilation, nihilistic property we're talking through. And that's one of the examples I'm thinking about. And that's why I'm bringing up why tradition with memory and spirit has such a powerful relationship with each other, because of that, through time. I'll stop with that.
No, fantastic. I'll throw it at Econ, right? I mean, just very quickly, it's making me think of the difference between smoothness from friction versus smoothness in friction, which to have smoothness in friction, you need anti-fragility, improvisation, the ability to handle obstacles that come up. And what ends up happening is, if we're going to basically not teach ends, then the only option then is basically smoothness from friction, because without a discussion of ends, we don't even know how to develop the way to react and be prepared for friction or anything. And so you end up basically in throwing out that discussion, which I have more to say on that, you end up in a lot of trouble. I'm also now thinking about how basically bills, taxes are what kind of create the illusion that conflating freedom and choice can compel people toward ends, because I have to pay the bills. Therefore, I'm going to go to the terrible downtown that's smooth. I'm going to go to these places and make them seem active because I have to pay my bills. So then that actually creates the illusion of successful architecture, or not declining American cities, as Jacobs would talk about, when really it's actually just the necessity of having to pay the bills. But then it's kind of an Ouroboros in a way, because the system that conflates freedom and choice also is the one that creates the bills that then force you to act, that makes it look like freedom and choice is all you need because ends take care of themselves, when really it's basically the need to pay for bills, the need to avoid the tax man. And then you just get in status, the need to impress the Joneses, the need to not be behind. And it's always this external force. And you see, you could almost say, like, in this sense, nihilism, There's a grace in nihilism in the meaning crisis, is because it's when unveiling those external ways to make people act eventually run out and no longer convince people, which then unveils that actually you do have to discuss ends. You actually do have to get into all of these things. So this kind of, this inability, in this way, the growth of hikimoriism, the people in Japan that never leave their apartments, which I think is spreading around the world in different forms, actually, it's actually, in a sense, has a grace to it because it's unveiling that eventually compelling people to act for status or compelling people to act even in terms of like necessity or wants or desire distinct from drive and like Lacan eventually exhausts itself, which makes us actually ask the question about ends. And in that sense, there's a kind of grace in it. But it's a painful grace, like a Flannery O'Connor story or something like that. But let me throw it to Econ here. Econ, please.
Hey, thank you once again. Tons of good information to unpack. So again, we hit back on this idea of urban planning, and this is something again that I'm really forceful for on the work of Jane Jacobs, and I'm not going to beat that one to death. If anyone wants to unpack that more, I honestly say go back and watch the previous video with me and Rose. It's a lot more thorough understanding of what's going on. But I do want to point something out on this idea of the living soul that he brought up, and this is one of the biggest controversial positions that anyone can have, right? So I was just having a conversation the other day, and someone was talking about how, one, they don't understand the Eucharist, and two, they don't understand why this wouldn't be a violation of Mosaic law, which Mosaic law says don't drink the blood of animals, right? And then you actually like unpack what's being said there. So there's two things that we have to understand: that men are not animals. I know it's crazy to say that. It's really controversial, but men are not animals. Now, why does it matter about blood? Well, first and foremost, blood is the life force of an animal, right? Like it's the movement of an animal from a biblical perspective, right? And this is why many of the saints will say, hey, animals, they don't actively participate in God's end, right? They're passive participants in reality. They are energy without like essence in a certain sense. And so this really has to be understood. So when we drink their blood, we're actually drinking their life force, like at a literal, physical to really a metaphysical way. Now, why does this matter? Okay, so we can't do this because, one, we don't own that life force. It's not ours. So if we drink it, we're taking something from someone else, right? This life force is also for the atonement of sins, again, from the Mosaic perspective. And then we think about what the living soul is in a man and why this works in such a way. And as he was talking about being in telos, it's the agent. This agency is, in the modern sense, has become the primary understanding of personhood, right? And this is where it gets really weird. And I hate to say this, but like all of the conversations that go on in anthropology from a metaphysical and a theological perspective, they all rely on this idea that agent equals person equals individual. And I cannot for the life of me understand why this is. Why do we have politics if at all, if there is no agency outside of the individual? Like it's mind-blowing to me. But the reason I bring it up, and we're going to run back all of this through, is that as he was laying out and as he did so eloquently, and again, as I was trying to show, the collective here is an actual thing. It's a real thing that has to be understood. And going back to that statement on memory and blood and living and soul, now when he references this idea of an agent, I tend to think of it as what I call in cybernetics a deliberative agent. So you have an agent and then you have a deliberative agent, right? The world that we live in, which is a sensate culture, which, by the way, Peterum Sorokin had this idea of sensate cultures, which is everything that Jockin just expressed, and then ideational cultures. And those are ones that primarily deal with this like spiritual space. And to be a good civilization, you need both, right? You don't want to just die, but you also don't want to spend the rest of your life sludging away at your 9 to 5, going to the city, because I do this and it's horrible. If I didn't have my friends with me, I would have nothing. Right. And so in this, we have this idea of memory. Now, what I'm referencing again is this idea of a deliberative agent, someone who has the ability to deliberate. And again, if we have this ability to deliberate, we must use it. It's a responsible task. We are given it. And it's not just at the level of a person, it's at the level of a culture, it's at the level of a society, it's at the level of a nation. And there's a lot of stuff that's being asked in my latest video. How do we deal with the problems of having this managerial society that's caused by this frictionless choice matrix, that's caused by this increasing amount of choices that allows us to have maximal freedom? But how do we deal with that in our day-to-day lives as like an actual thing? Like, first and foremost, you have to have a first principle. Like, you have to have something that's going to ground you into an ideational part of a culture. If you stay in the sensate culture, you're only going to stay and live and breathe and lose what it is to be a human. And again, I keep harping on that, but I think that that's really important when we're unpacking all of these major problems. But the second piece is that we really need to understand and live by the first principle, because the first principle is where the telos is. And as you said earlier, many people, when they're making their economic decisions, they're not bound by a telos. They're not bound by anything. They're just making choices because that's what's relevant to them at the time. And this is why people like James Buchanan come up with a subjectivist ontology, because we don't know another way to actually deal with this problem. Because at the end of the day, most people really do. They just act and live and breathe almost entirely on system 2 thinking. They almost never touch system 1. And when they do touch system 1, it's almost entirely fantastical and imaginatory. And just think about what our day-to-day lives are. They're entirely fantastical. They're entirely imaginatory. And all of the actual things that we do on a day-to-day basis are driven by autonomous cognition. And so when we actually really understand what a sensate culture is, it's a culture that removes us from having real feelings, real understandings in the real world, to where everything, because we lack it, we have to push it off into these fantastical elements. And, that's why video games and anime and all of that's on such a big high, because we lack this ability to interact on any other level other than being autonomous, other than, okay, I have friends at work. What do y'all do? I don't know. We talk. What do y'all talk about? The weather. Now, for me, I would love to talk about the weather, but that's a whole nother story. But for most people, it's going to be, simple things. It's not anything useful. It's just, talking. But the last thing, and then I'm going to jump off and let y'all talk for a little bit. I want to point this out. Frederick Bastiat, right? So going back to this debate on what it is to be a conservative versus libertarian, I was an alumni at the Mercatus Center for the Frederick Bastiat. And I remember arguing with these people because, it's a mix of some liberals and then some libertarians, mostly libertarians, and some progressive liberals, right? And everyone is harping on Bastiat being like this libertarian leader of thought. And I'm just sitting there thinking, like, have y'all actually read Bastiat? He wasn't libertarian at all. He wrote this famous book, Harmonies of Political Economy. And let's unpack this. If the laws of providence are harmonious, it is when they act with freedom, without which there is no harmony. Whenever then we remark an absence of harmony, we may be sure that it proceeds from an absence of liberty, an absence of justice. Oppressors, spoilators, contemptors of justice, you can have no part in the universal harmony, for it is you who disturb it. Now, I'm sure some libertarian can go, absolutely, that's the non-aggression principle. But they entirely miss the point that order is the first principle before you get to the rest. You can't have a society of libertinism if you don't have a society internally devoted to a higher authority, because on his deathbed, he said the only thing that he regretted was not writing a full economic treatise for the Catholic Church, because he wanted to show that the market only functions because God wills the order out of men's poor choices. Not that it was just random happen chance, like people think, like, oh, it's because of, the way that the market works with the demand and the supply and the changes in prices, that this allocation of resources happens to its most efficient place because of the market mechanism. He was like, yeah, there's a market mechanism that's fundamentally ordering principle from the logos of the universe, not because man's random happenstance of choices somehow maximize order. So, yeah.
No, I think that's very well put. It makes me think, McCloskey has made this point as well, that for someone like Adam Smith, there's kind of two invisible hands. There's the invisible hand of, quote unquote, the market, obviously wealth of nation. But then, of course, you have in the theory of moral sentiments, it's more of a theological sort of notion. And I do think it's just very critical that for Adam Smith, you can't, in his day, there was this idea that if you wanted to sell your product, you had to interact face to face with other human beings. And that itself would naturally draw out, or could naturally draw out empathy. We all know that when you first meet someone, you tend to, even if you're having a bad day, you might try to hide it. You might try to speak well, because it can create a certain socialization and trying to hold back your instincts. And so there can be a humanizing principle, right? But that humanizing principle is not identical with the market mechanism. It's just that there was radical overlap between them in that particular historic moment, right? Smith did not think that the two hands were identical, but he saw how they could overlap. But then he goes to there are plenty of examples, obviously, when he's visiting more of the kind of the supply chain, when people that are working on the pens, like there's a dehumanizing aspect, and really you can see Smith is interesting in that there are parts of capitalism he gets excited about. When he sees the boy making the invention in volume 1 of The Wealth of Nations, he's like, that's cool. When he sees that the market can get people to interact and humanize, that's really cool. But then he sees this form of capitalism that is, people aren't interacting. They're just on the mass production. So that's where the invisible hands separate, right? Like there's a division of the invisible hands. But it's just very important to see that, yeah, there are places in the market where the two can overlap, where the ways that you make money will also train you toward ends or can lead to personhood, but not necessarily. Like this idea that they necessarily overlap, as opposed to they could overlap, but only to the degree that people are aware and they maintain it. And then, of course, even if you develop, say, virtue and maybe the mundane set, there's also the point that that's not necessarily the quote-unquote theological virtues, and that there's more work that has to be done. But the idea is that Smith does not have this simplistic idea that the invisible hand of the market is the quote-unquote invisible hand of civility, of making human civilization and human personhood, right? And in fact, I keep making the example of the hikikomori. I think the hikikomori is quite evidence that this is not the case, that you can get an efficiency that makes it to where you don't have to socialize, and therefore you don't enter into relation, and you don't therefore develop full personhood because you're not interrelating with other people, right? So there's a much more robust and complex debate going on that I think is just very, very important. A few more things come to mind, and then I'll throw it to Jockin, is that, yeah, like a way I think about it, and you've already alluded to it, is that there's kind of like, I'll read this paragraph from Jockin's paper, which I have a lot of underlines, and everyone go read it because you'll underline it too. You do not deliberate about ends. So I'm going to say bad liberalism. The liberalism that we have now, bad liberalism, or frictionless liberalism, however we want to put it. You do not deliberate about ends. You comply with a sequence already optimized on your behalf. What appears as convenience is also formation. Over time, such interactions train us not to choose well, but to accept what has been pre-selected as reasonable. I really love this paragraph because it's kind of the idea that whatever choices are on offer, it's reasonable. So if they double boot your truck, your vehicle, it's a reasonable process because there's a procedure. And I love also how in your video you say today, we no longer think that order is alignment with reality. We think order is procedure. That's exactly right. Whereas what you're pointing out classically is there's an idea that no, order comes from a certain alignment with reality, which means you have to be able to discern and participate in reality. Oh, well, that needs to be formed. But when I read that paragraph, you know, that idea that we basically assume the formation of the person in an environment of convenience. The more convenience we create, the more the person will be formed, because it's almost like we believe personhood just happens. Like if it doesn't happen, it's because something's in the way. Right? All of us would realize our personhood if only we had more choices, if only life was more convenient, if only things were smoother. When actually it's the roughness that draws out the personhood, when actually it is the obstacle that draws out the personhood, right? But we have this kind of philosophy that it would just happen, it would just come out if only we were to remove obstacles, when really it's the complete opposite. And I really also like this idea that you don't have to think because whatever is presented is reasonable, because it is efficient. Therefore, there's a funny way in which that's suggesting if you are thinking, it's bad. Because you shouldn't have to think. Like there's a weird way where thinking is bad, actually, right? You should be able to just go along, which of course is animalistic. Which of course is very, very problematic. Now, what I would say is this theory, Brave New World, this theory of society is perhaps theoretically possible if there was no possibility, as we've talked about before, of a birdie and donkey problem. Like if there was no possible world or possible situation where you end up with a birdie and donkey, then people would just keep flowing, right? Wherever the smoothness took them, they would keep going. But, as we've talked about, the birdie and donkey is when you have two piles of grain that are the exact same, and there's a donkey standing between them. And because the piles are exactly the same, the donkey can't make a reasonable choice, and it starves to death. Because both choices are equally reasonable, can't break the tie, therefore can't make a reasonable choice, therefore it dies, right? It gets paralyzed, right? And I think what you're getting at, where the expansion of choice creates nihilism, is because it creates a kind of birdie and donkey, because it makes all choice arbitrary. There's no deeper telos to any of them. Therefore, there is no way to make a decision to choose X over Y. And even if you do, it ultimately feels arbitrary, and that's unveiled in the choice. So the next choice you learn, and eventually everyone ends up like the meaning crisis is a kind of spread of the birdie and donkey, the feeling of a certain birdie and donkey, like whatever choices could be made, they're arbitrary. And I think what you're pointing at is that without the divine, or without memory, without blood, without spirit, then what I'll say is that's a vertical dimension. So if in the horizontal, it's inevitable that you will eventually end up in a birdie, because life is such that you will eventually end up in a birdie and donkey problem. If you don't have access to the vertical, quote unquote, then when you end up in the birdie and donkey problem, you're stuck. Game over. Like you can't get out of it. You're done. So you end up in nihilism. But if you had access to maybe memory, even though the two choices between you are both equally reasonable, you could say, remember the tradition, or remember something, bring it into that situation and break the tie, right? Or if you were to bring in beauty, you could break the tie. If I were to say kind of in a cybernetic sense, and I'll throw it at Jockin here, like if the world is this kind of movement of agents in situations, we'll say agents in situations, and it is inevitable, or it is practically inevitable, that the average agent at some point in their life will end up in a birdie and donkey problem, then it is necessarily the case that the average person will at some point need the ability to make a decision beyond simply rationality, or else that will be the situation where they get stuck and end up in nihilism and they get paralyzed. And if it is inevitable at some point that the average agent ends up in that situation, then you have a system that will necessarily fail, because eventually people will get there and then they'll get stuck. And then that will happen on the social level. And then it all creates a very bad feedback loop. And basically, when you say a deliberate agent, an agent who can deliberate, basically, when you say that, what I hear is that only a deliberate agent is able to break a birdie and donkey problem, because they can make a decision according to a principle beyond what is in the immediacy, right? That is what is given to them, right? They're able to see that one of the choices is actually better than the other for some reason that is not reducible to the reason that is simply horizontal or on offer, right? So if it is inevitable that the average person will eventually end up in a birdie and donkey problem, then the average person needs to be a deliberate agent, dang it, or they're going to end up there and starve to death, or they got to be nudged. They got to be nudged out of the frickin' birdie and donkey problem. So then your AI tech bros are like, well, let's not make deliberate agents. Let's just make sure everybody's nudged, or make sure that everything moves so fast that nobody can stop between two piles of grain per se, right? Like they're always going so fast that it never occurs. Well, that means they never discern or make choices, and they're just, you know, it's like the angel of history in that CLE program. Or you make sure there's one pile of grain, which is the dictator, right? Like, you know, people decide you get one choice, and that's not really good. So this was, so we either become deliberate, or, and I'll throw it to Jockin. We either gain the ability to deliberate, or the options on offer are this. Make sure there's only one pile of grain, which means you need a totalitarian dictator, big brother, to make sure there are, you know, only one pile of grain. 2, you need nudging, which is to make sure that when you end up in that pile, something can nudge you to one of those two piles versus the other, or nudge you out of the situation. Or 3, you move so fast that you never come to a standstill between two piles of grain, right? Like you're just always moving, which maybe is a pulverilio option. I don't like those 3. I like the deliberate agent one, but that means you need something vertical. That means you need a factor. Lack is not nothing. You need something present in all possible situations that is able to break the tie. And that would be lack and so on. But let me throw it to Jockin on any thoughts on anything.
I mean, part of the issue, and this is, I haven't talked about this yet. I'm starting to get the essay stuff together for this. It's the 10, but Econ knows, I talked to Econ about this privately in chat, is that, like, for example, in education, but I see it across the board, is that we have polarization by bimodal population distribution. The classical logic from Aristotle about political order was on the mean, the middle class, like the populational mean and the central tendencies would held everything together. But what we're seeing more and more is at the very minimum a virtualization of that mean, meaning there are no, even though maybe in statistical analysis that mean might still exist. But for example, I'll use a concrete example. My class has a central tendency of about a C, a B, but my actual students are not CB students. You know what my students are? They're all A's or all F's. There is no one in the middle. So the entire protocol of how to teach and hold that class together as a social grouping is almost impossible, because there's nothing boundedness. There's no boundedness to connect the disparate groups together. Now, I just bring this up because I've talked to people in lower level teaching, like kindergarten through 6, and what they say is you got a certain population is super intelligent, locked in, basically autism, like basically a variation of that. And then you have absolute chaos, basically completely disordered neuroticism. Either neuroticism, depression, you got that angle, or you got psychosis, or you got perversion, to kind of use Lacanian language. So basically the human subject is being polarized into these vectors of different personality behaviors. And the argument is, yeah, and then we'll just let a social order nudge them into compliance. And the particularities of how that plays out don't matter. I don't think we realize that is so beyond any classical political order logic. I don't think we realize the magnitude of what we're suggesting when we talk about it this way. Because we can't even look, and then that means old models from the past won't apply if we do this, if we go down this trajectory. And this is so close. Now we have a problem. At least I'm talking now, again, this is outside my domain of expertise or any area of talk conversation. So I kind of throw this because I see this problem presenting itself to me. What would be the response to this in the terms of, yeah, this is what our protocol is going to do, political order, this radical bimodalism on every kind of quality of analysis, which will lead to basically this vector, this atomization of the kind of person of a psychoanalysis point of view of how desire will be mediated by psychosis, perversion, or psychosis, perversion, and neuroticism. And that basically no one will actually be able to make choice anymore properly. And thus we need a totalizing state that via legalism of operational algorithmic spaces will nudge people into protocols to produce the most optimal outcome. But the problem is, this is, how can we possibly think that there's so many, I feel like there's so much presumption here of the social stability of a political order that would allow this to even occur, that I'm getting very suspicious that would be even possible. I have another note, by the way. I think, because by the way, the question is, so this has been going on for a bit. I'm putting more, this is more speculative statements. This is just me going for it. These are just ideas I've had in my head. I've not written down and thought through with seriousness yet. I think the introduction of personal finance, personal debt, is a very important element of this. How do we mediate this problem? I don't think people realize that personal credit cards is a very modern intervention. 70s, 80s, I think 90s, if I remember correctly. I think the personal credit card it's a 90s, 80s intervention. I don't think people realize, this is actually why when we talk about memory, why is this important? Why does history matter? Because something we take it for granted, like, of course you get credit cards. But we realize that this has basically been a protocol to mediate desire and lack of choice in decision-making and deliberation. Because think about it. What does personal credit debt do? Unsecured debt allows you to pull into your future desire to get what you want now into the future. So we're stretching into time to get what we want from the future into now. And the argument is made basically because it's unsecured debt, the high interest rate will yield for it. And it leads, but you see what I mean by this point is that, like, I think we're already, one of the statements that we've already done to try to address this is personalized credit card debt. And again, very, Daniel, your point of made about, like, the parameters of choice, right? We have a certain parameterization, and to think of, like, someone asking that question, well, wait a minute, what's this going on with personal credit cards? Like, I have them, for example, but what is the implications of that? Especially when it was contingent. It wasn't always existing. It wasn't like personal credit card debt existed all the time. This is just part of the human nature. That's what we had. No, it didn't exist. And just because it's common does not mean it didn't come from a certain reasoning, or it came to address, basically patch hole a stressor. Like this political discourse discussion, my point I'm getting at here by bringing this up is to say the stretching of the human person, the obliteration of the middle class, or just of all of basically central tendencies of social ordering to polarization. One of the ways we've dealt with this is using capital, specifically personalized credit card debt, is one of the ways of mediating this. But the question becomes, well, how long is that going to hold? Or some people could probably say, it's okay, we'll be fine, I guess, except normally that's true when not everybody has personal credit cards. I want to point out something. If you don't have a credit, and that's the thing too, I want to point this out, that credit score, that FICO score, decides your access to certain goods. You can't get a house without a FICO score. Can you get a car? Seriously questionable if you get it without a FICO score. So thus, again, this discussion of terms of service brutalism has actually been here. And isn't that interesting? They're like, well, it's just algorithmic logic. No one's deciding it. And it was presented as a response to racism. Meaning, and it was true because redlining was absolutely a thing, especially with houses. Like, again, I'm not challenging this, but I'm not bringing this up to say, and therefore we should have races. No, I'm not doing this. But I'm simply pointing out, like, that was one of the logics of it, that the human person in our social relationships had things that were considered moral evils, racism. No, let an algorithm calculate this. Let an algorithm decide what of your fittingness to have a loan given to you. Because let's think about this conception of what a loan is. This is the argument that someone, you have a speculation to get something, a house, a business, whatever, and you're asking other people to give you money so you can go get this now. I mean, we did this with our families and our friends. Like, we asked them for friends and family loans. Like, that relationship, that's what all loans were at one point, right? A majority of loans were that. And therefore, banks had to know the person. They knew the people who they were giving loans to. And they made individual judgments about, can this be a trustworthy loan? Is this worth the risk? And making all those personal decision makings. But what came along the way with it was, quite frankly, racism. To say, no, I'm not going to give my money to you to start a business or to buy a house. And people said that's not right. So let's abstract it, because a human person is prone for prejudice and bigotry. So let's abstract away to an algorithm, a FICO score, and that's more just, because that now gets people everyone have access to it. But now here's the consequence, especially when we combine that with things like personal finance, personal credit card debt, unsecured debt assets like that. Now we've created a way to block out people from society, from certain social orders and goods, and things like the zip code. The zip code is absolutely, listen, no one likes hearing this. Zip codes are still absolutely segregated. Like, certain zip codes have certain populations that are certain social classes versus others. That still exists with the FICO score system. It still exists. We just did it. We just created that process of discernment, of discrimination and separation. We just did it via an algorithmic process that has all the appearance of absolute impropriety and justice. So I'm just pointing out, like, we're already going through me talking through this is we're already going through it. And the antagonisms of race in America especially still show, even on these protocols, FICO scores to stop us from redlining, Obama becoming president, so a Messianic perfection of the original sin of racism has been addressed now that Obama became president. Oh, wait, no, it didn't. You know, it goes to show that these antagonisms still existing. And what's the answer? It's just going to be more algorithmic protocols with siloing. Basically, we're stripping out of the middle, pushing things to extremes of polarization. And the goal is, as you keep saying, Daniel, this is just pointing out another, and Hikimori's is another example of that. That's more of a Japanese application of it culturally, but it's still the same premise, in my opinion. I'm just applying it through other domains as well. Again, these are all speculations, so I haven't really thought this through it systematically, but everyone's discussion here is kind of bringing this to the foreground to me. Because I say this because econs, especially a discussion about, the blood, there's two kinds of life from Aristotle. There's Zoe and Bios. Bios, which Aaron Haran kind of picks up on, is this political space of life. Your life as a human person is both the Zoe of a general sense, which the animal has access to. But when Econ says that humans are not just animals or not animals, this is what he's getting at, is this Bios part, that the human person is also of a political community. That is something kind of drawn forth, kind of picking out from. And that's why this matters so much. So all this discourse about race or social relationship are things mediated through things like FICO scores, because it decides what bios you're permitted to go to. Which zip code you're living in is decided by which house you can get. And you can't get a house, you can't get a loan, at least in America especially. And by the way, another tangent note, I've talked in other discussions, I'll stop with this, is, this intersection actually has some serious problems culturally. I'm Muslim, so this, in the Muslim discourse, is a huge problem of ziba, interest. How do you get a house without interest? It's a serious contention, because now we have a problem where actually it plays out with the dating market. People can't get married because they can't get a house. The house is normally the dowry requirement, typically in marriage. So when Muslim males can't get married because they don't have the economic resources to get the house to proceed forward with it. And I say this because there's reported multiple dating sites, like Islamic matchmaking and things like that, peripheral of women. But where's the constraints on the men? Because the men must be of a certain economic output to be able to get married, especially in the West. I find these are just notes to bring up. I'm talking about how the economic with the algorithmic spaces and this kind of algorithmic protocol systems, which were meant to save us from the biases and bigotry of human relationship actually entraps us into systems and logics of separation in the biospace. And I'll stop with that.
I think it's very well put. I mean, you've got that line at first glance. So these structures appear purely rational, even just, insofar as they claim to eliminate human bias and prejudice. And I think that's the idea, right? The algorithm, the systems, they remove the human, therefore they're more just. But actually, what ends up happening, even if they somehow say remove the problem of redlining, if these algorithms flatten the human person, right, then there's an injustice in that. And that's what many of the people like Charles W. Mills, who wrote a great book on Blackness Visible, there's this idea that even like that, there's actually a compression of Black identity into a fungible commodity that the algorithm in the name of justice brings about. Right. And so, yeah, just because you say overcome one injustice through the algorithm, there may be another you get another injustice that occurs there. I'm very interested by what you're saying about debt. I'm also thinking about that, just kind of live thoughts here. You know, Econ was making the very important point on the idea that without first principles, you can't limit choice, right? And if you can't limit choice, it expands and you can't make choice and you have no standard by which to make choices. So you need a kind of limiting principle that simultaneously creates meaning. So you need a first principle for that. There's an odd way in which debt is almost trying to replace the first principle because what it does is once you are in debt, that in a sense limits the choices you can make because you have to pay off the debt, right? And so it is a kind of nudge in disguise, I want to say, actually. And so what it's doing is debt solves the first principle problem, right? Until it runs out, until it doesn't work anymore. And then, because I've been reviewing William Strauss and Neil Howe's Generations, and they came up with the fourth turning stuff. I really like the Generations book. The first one, it's very nuanced and it's very interesting. And I really like how they describe the fourth turning, transitioning to the high of the first turning. And there's this kind of idea that there's a crisis that gives way to the reinvention of civic institutions, values, and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking about that as well. And I say that because there's a way in which debt, for a time, indeed binds choice. It creates a sort of limit, but without people doing the work of being able to create limits themselves, right? And so debt is kind of hiding that lack of first principles. And I suppose if theoretically the debt never got called in or you never had a global financial problem or whatever, it might work out. But history is a long story where eventually that doesn't go so well and the fourth turning turns into a war and a crisis. And unfortunately, we tend to become deliberate agents again with first principles after the crisis that makes us realize, oh, we don't want to do that again. So all that metaphysical stuff we thought was stupid, actually it was important. And then we go back to it because giant modern war and crises is pretty terrible, right? And it's almost like we get set up for that because we keep making algorithmic processes that for a time conceal the consequences of not having first principles until it's too late, until it gets to this extreme point where it boils over and there's massive problems. So it is very interesting to think of, because if there's a way to create action to avoid birdie and donkeys, which is I create goods you desire, so then that makes you keep going. Well, I can also just make you in debt where there's something behind you pushing you along, so it's either debt or desire, that's pushing you, threat or desire, carrot or stick, and I can keep you moving. So then I avoid the birdie and donkey problem, but I'm actually on an ontological level not avoiding the birdie and donkey problem. I'm concealing it. I'm repressing it. I'm hiding it because I haven't made deliberate agents. So it's all this algorithm. And I should also note, hey, the whole belonging again, the talk about the loss of Givens, Givens caused racism. Givens caused xenophobia. When it was given that whites are better than black, when it was given that this is how we do society, people found belonging because they didn't have to think so much. They weren't existential, but it created injustice. So the removal of givens is a real creation of justice. The problem is givens also held back the algorithm per se. Givens also held back the flattening of personhood. It created a space where things were not smooth, and they weren't supposed to be smooth, dang it. So when you remove givens, then you create quote unquote justice, but you also lose a way to make sure the world isn't made overly smooth or overly fungible. And you also lose a defense from algorithmic processes that then come in and take over personhood, and you lose personhood. So I think that's where we are. And basically we have to think, I mean, the other issue too with like, you have to have a diversity of deliberate agents. And I'm saying that as well because you were making the point of the loss of the mean, right? Where you have the John Galt and the last men, right? Like you have the super individuals. But don't worry, Jockin, we're going to deal with that with biotech and CRISPR technology. We'll just make everyone a John Galt. So then it will be fine. According to I don't know what standard of value. And boy, howdy, you want to look... You want to unleash that technology without a first principles debate or a debate about ends, that'll be grand. But anyway, but there's this idea that it's like, well, guys, we're all good. We got some John Galts, we got some Supermen, and they can be deliberate agents, and we'll be good. The problem is you need a diversity of deliberate agents about a entire range of particular situations. That means you need to have a whole lot of them, right? And if you don't, then you have a very fragile system. The system overall will be very, very fragile. And probably all those deliberate agents are going to do the thing where they get into a gated community and get their drones to stop the popularist revolution. And we've seen this movie, haven't we? So that strategy of not being able to spread the condition of being a deliberate agent is not a good idea. And I think that happens way too much. Look, there's this idea of there's always a natural aristocracy for Jefferson, the talented 10th, the Du Bois, and different things. And yeah, there's something to be said about, talent, I suppose, but that's a really dangerous strategy. And it does not work because ultimately the system proves to be fragile because you need the ability to be deliberate. It also tends to over-index IQ and a certain set of intelligence that ends up more in abstract knowledge versus that particular knowledge that hype would stress. Like even, no matter how smart I'll throw it to Econ here. I have more notes, but I'll just keep talking. Like no matter how smart Albert Einstein was, unless he worked at the McDonald's on Ward's Road, he didn't know how many plastic spoons they needed to order next week, right? Like that's that idea that the majority of decisions in the society are a result of accidental knowledge, like particular knowledge that can only be known in particular circumstances that needs agents in those situations that can deliberate to make those decisions well. And no amount of IQ can make up for that issue of the necessity of particular knowledge, right? And if you have a lack of deliberate agents in those particular situations, they will probably not make good decisions in those particular circumstances, and the system will suffer for it. And that's when all the people get their gated communities, and I don't like where that movie goes. But I have more to say, but I'll stop and throw it to Econ. Econ!
Yeah, thank you. No, that was awesome, especially that last bit. Everything you just laid, like that's the argument made by Hayek, right? People have to understand that. That's the argument against any type of centralization. Local knowledge refutes any type of higher order downward pressure on decision making. And it was a part of the original paper that I had done against nudges was making this epistemic argument, but I was like, I feel like that's too easy, and that's why I went down the ontological route, which is exactly what you were talking about earlier. And man, okay, so you brought up debt. I know. And so before we get to debt, because I'm gonna jump all over that like a fat kid on cake. All right, so we had this. All right, we cannot deliberate without a first principle. Like, I don't think people understand. Like, okay. Science doesn't work without a first principle of intelligibility of the universe. Like First principles are an axiom of cognition, of epistemics, of anything, right? And if we are to believe that discernment is a real process, we have to understand that there has to be a capacity for understanding the differences between object A and object B, right? And the only way that we can know a difference between A and B is that there is a highest order of object that allows for it. And the best part, I hope everybody does this, go and read George Spencer Brown's Law of Forms. He has a whole idea about how to draw a distinction, and what it means for a distinction to be is like, okay, so you draw a circle and then you move like a little nibble outside of the circle. Well, then you have to draw a distinction on the thing that's outside of the circle. So like that's the level of discernment that's necessary. So you have the circle, that's the first principle. Anything outside of that necessarily is distinct. And again, rolling this back through, Niklas Luhmann worked a lot on, this is the most random thing, Nicholas of Cusa's work. People don't know this. He was a huge fan of Nicholas of Cusa. I don't know why, but I'll explain why. I think he was really religious. I think some things happened or whatever, but he said that God created by distinction. So creation ex nihilo is the creation by distinction, which is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the discernment of distinctions, and that our first principle is required for the distinctions to be made. So for us to understand and cognize the distinctions, it requires a first principle. So it's the inverse of the proposition. And that's why things like faith, again, let's take Leibniz, for example. Intelligibility presupposes a rational order, right? Like, for you to have inquiry, you have to presuppose the trust in that truth's knowability. That's basic Leibniz, which, by the way, Gauss said the same thing. I didn't know this. Total tangent, sorry. Jockin has been a part of this conversation. I actually got legitimately mad. I was reading some work on Gauss because that's what you do, I suppose. I don't know. I've got nothing else better to do with my life, I guess. But I was reading this thing on Gauss, and it was like, Gauss is like an atheist. And I was like, okay, they said this with Leibniz. I went and read all the stuff. He's definitely not at all even close to an atheist. And so I read Gauss, and it was like, Gauss was like, oh yeah, I couldn't solve this problem. And, I went and prayed and came back, and the Holy Spirit gave me the answer. And it's like, well, he's an atheist. How do you conclude that? I read like tons of his letters. It's ridiculous. But anyway, that's the point. There has to be this intelligibility that's presupposed, and we have to participate in that intelligibility. But before you can participate in it, you have to understand that it's there. Real quick on this idea that Jockin said of memory, I don't deny memory. Again, I'm not as big of an Aristotelian guy, this, but I am big into Bourdieu. Now, Bourdieu doesn't have to concede determinism in his work on habitus. Habitus is real because, repetition is something that consistently happens in time. That's a real thing. So our moral status, that's what we were talking about in this conversation, the pariasis, and how the deliberative agent is interacting. That moral status depends on multiple things. It can't be the ends justify the means, and it can't be on intentions, because intentions without the ends is a road to hell. There's no salvation without judgment. So we have to have the ability to determine and understand that, right? And so what our formation is coming from both the moral status. It's formed by how it orients us and what we are oriented to, right? So that's kind of the answer to that. So it's not that I disagree. It's just that sometimes the word play is different, because I think that habitus, again, from the work of Bourdieu, it's something that's generational. It's not just something that's entirely enculturated, right? So I'm enculturated by my family. I'm also enculturated by my county, my city, all of these other things. But it's a large enculturation process. And the largest of them is the one that's generational, which is why generational trauma is a thing, because it's an enculturated adaptation that happens in the local social dynamics of the family. And when we talk about what it means to be a chooser and all of this, right? Like one of the most forgotten pieces. Anyway, I'll get to that. That's a whole nother story on receptivity as primal grace. It's not as connected to this, but we'll get to that another show. You had called everything vertical to the first principle. I thought that was beautiful. Statistical analysis of the mean. This is a dead thing. As an econometrician, I want to point out that people aren't doing regressions on the mean anymore. That's just not a thing. And part of it is because everything is becoming a bimodal distribution, but part of it is because hierarchy has been shown to be a statistically significant and economically significant understanding of what's going on. So there was this great guy, his name is Conacher, Knoecker. I'm not really good at saying his name. He came up with what's called a quantile regression. Quantile regressions, they are percentage regressions. Okay, so if I take the whole and I regress at the mean, boom, we've got our mean. So instead of that, you actually have at the 10% level, 20% level, 30% level, 40% level, then you have the mean 60, 70, 80, 90. Each one of these is a different regression. And each one of these give you different amount of information. And so you use this quantile regression to bucket things and bucket people so that they can be able to unpack this in a more serious way. Anyway, so because of this, we don't really regress to the mean anymore, or not regress to the mean. We really don't do regressions to the mean anymore. It's actually way more relevant economically and statistically to use quantile regressions. And I've been forcing this down everybody's throat in my own field in econometrics, and I'm not the only one, because it makes the most sense, especially when you start talking about political distributions and stuff like that, because political distributions, yes, they're bimodal, but they're actually infinitely arranged, or however many numbers you have, there are that many arrangements. So and on the bimodal distribution and the polarization, Spengler, I think, is someone who comes to mind on this topic. And on the idea of debt, real quick, I think this is the most important piece. Debt is a fundamental hatred of reality. All right, so you have to deal with Ziba. I myself, as an Orthodox Christian, there's nothing more anathema than usury. I work at a bank. That is a moral quandary. Now, I will say I'm with St. Justinian here, that I think there's a difference between interest and usury. Interest is something that can be utilized to understand the moment of the business and figuring out what's going on for the future, but I think it always has to be capped. Like, I think he capped it at like 6%, or 12% would be like the maximum for like a really, really long loan, right? And it's not like a compounding interest. It's just the interest is added to the principal. It's not a compound. And I think that makes more sense. But in general, debt is the most evil thing in the world. And this is why I wanted to bring this up. And I'm glad you brought this up. Debt as a first principle that you brought up, that's slavery. That's literally definitionally slavery. Not only is it slavery, it's the most important anthropological reality that anyone can read the scriptures and get. Why is there such a fight right now in Orthodoxy against original guilt? Well, because people disagree on what it means to be in debt. When we have Christ comes and says, I have put the debt away, who are we in debt to? Are we in debt to God? We're in debt to Satan, because we've lost our pact and covenant with God through Adam. Our pact is now with Satan. We are indebted to Satan. He's the prince of the air. He rules everything, right, on earth. That's a part of the debt that man has to pay to be a suffering, deliberative agent to choose God rightly and justly, right? And if we really want to think about this, and not just that, like the liability that one gains from debt, that puts you in a place of a lack of choices, like y'all had said. But how did we even get here? Well, it's hiding and it's taking away our deliberation. But what it's really shown is that there is wordplay with things like equity and equality. Like y'all were talking about the algorithm. The algorithm is to build this equity and equality, but that's not actually doing that. What it's doing is it's putting it at the expense of justice. And when you do that, you become lost to satanic moralism. Like, go look at the morals and ethics of the Church of Satan. Like, it's very clear. All of it is very self-imposed, self-reliable, self-relational in the fact that it doesn't actually go anywhere else but the self, right? And that's what debt becomes. Debt becomes the entire entity of the self. Even though you're beholden to someone else, it's entirely put upon you. It's an ontological shift of your reality. And the reason I kind of want to like last touch on this is what do we do in a system that we have debt, right? Like this is like a legit question that's like hard up and like orthodox economists and stuff like that. They're trying to figure out a way to understand debt relations. I gotta be honest, the best answer from this I actually seen comes from the Roman Catholics and their integralist system. It's actually really, really good. I highly recommend someone to go and read the works. I think it was Pope Pius the Ninth who wrote against socialism and wrote what is now the Catholic social teachings. It has a really, really good section on debt. The Russian church actually just took it and said, we'll modify some words here and use it. But the key is we as a society have to come up with a way to get around this debt, because like you were talking about credit cards, like this is a new thing. We don't have memory for it. This is crushing people's lives. I don't know if y'all watched that one guy, Caleb Hammer, I think. Like he's always on there and he's having these conversations with these people and they just cannot comprehend. They are slaves to their passions and they're slaves to their passions, again, Satan, and it's done through debt, Satan. Like why do you think there's so much anti-Semitism? It's connected to this. It's all connected to this, because the more people start understanding these fundamental principles and really looking at it, they start looking for someone to blame. Now, I'm not saying that we should go blame any group of people. Really, we should blame ourselves first and foremost. But that's what's happening. And what we're becoming is a habit of debt and a habit of slavery. And because of that, we give up who we are to the manager. Why do we give up who we are to the manager? Because if I'm not willing to, if I'm not willing to govern myself, someone is going to be more than willing to govern me, against me, for them, for their benefit. And these are the same people that talk about everything that you just said about Adam Smith, all of the people that want to box people into IQ. They all want to have this very particular managerial style of understanding reality and how ordering isn't a principle, but it's ordering as a process that controls you and dominates you in your fiber of your being. And that's the brutalism. That's why conservatives aren't conservative anymore. They don't care about that. They don't care about what it means to preserve life, liberty, and justice. They only care about, I have more than you, therefore I matter more than you because I'm preserving the hierarchy and you should do as I will. So they're all basically Satan.
Yeah. So first off, that was magnificent. Second, so there's something about me where it's almost like the satanic is a simulacra of a first principle, or it's the satanic is when the vertical is actually, it's a disguised vertical that's actually horizontal in a sense, right? And the problem with debt is like, debt is functioning as a first principle. So there's a way in which the age is satanic in the sense of that its means of deliberation is not human. It's algorithmic. It is a procedure. Like the way that you're escaping the birdie and donkey problem is actually the very thing that created the birdie and donkey problem. So it is actually satanic because it's not a freedom. It's actually just maintaining the architecture where freedom and choice are the same, which hides the fact, because there is a sense where Satan is like deceitful, right? So if it is satanic, it would make sense that it also hides the fact that it is satanic by maintaining a simulacra of motion that is based on the vertical when it's actually just the horizontal in disguise. Because isn't it weird? I mean, I'm now thinking how debt is like lack is not nothing. It's kind of like it's kind of a metaphysical thing, right? Like debt is metaphysical, but it's not one that makes you toward beauty. It actually enslaves you from the beautiful, because there's a way in which like debt keeps you trapped in the vector of the good, because there's a way in which debt is like you're bad. Like debt is like you're bad. So you orient all your focus on being good, which is paying your debts, which distracts you from beauty. So your whole life gets captured in a vector of the good, as Jockin and I will talk about, and you never get to the beautiful. But you're not even like allowed to move toward the beautiful because all your motions are determined by a movement of what gets you out of debt. And so I'm now also associating slavery with the inability to move from the vector of the good to the beautiful. You're actually unable to move vertically per se. You're stuck in the horizontal. And the satanic is what makes possible movement in the horizontal without the vertical, when in truth you can only move in the horizontal with the vertical. Therefore it's a deception. It's a simulacra, right? And yeah, it's satanic. So that's great. I think also this idea of debt and slavery, yeah, because a deliberate without the vertical, you're going to be a slave, or you're dead, because you starved to death between the birdie and donkey. So dead and the Grand Inquisitor and all of that go together. I'm now thinking about that. What I was going to say too is to perhaps make, for me, the point on needing a vertical for intelligibility. Like you need to agree on the possibility of Leibniz and all of that you were describing. Perhaps, an example I would make for people on why you require the vertical for any intelligibility ultimately, even if you don't think you do, because that's ultimately what's happening here. Like we all actually are operating according to something vertical. It's just that we don't know we are, therefore we can't be deliberate about it, and therefore deliberate in light of it, right? So you end up in pathology. There's a difference, and I base it on Leibniz. What's the difference between listing and counting? If I list numbers, if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, am I counting? No, I'm actually listing. I'm not actually counting. If I'm counting, I say 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple. I have to have a shared quality. Meaningful quantification requires quality. I can actually not, there's no such thing as meaningful quantification that's not just merely listing without something outside the quantification, which is a quality. I can only count in reference to a quality. When I say there are 4 apples over there, I'm saying there are 4 things that I judge sharing a quality. So the intelligibility of the number 4 comes as meaningful, comes from reference to a quality that is beyond the quantification, right? So what ends up happening is we think that when I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I'm counting, but actually I'm more just listing numbers. And what ends up happening is intelligibility would not be possible if it wasn't in reference to something beyond it, that it is making intelligible. Likewise, I can count because I'm counting something beyond the quantification that makes the quantification intelligible to me. If I never saw someone counting 4 apples and I just started going 1, 2, 3, 4, it's what are you talking about, dog? I have no idea what you're talking about. We come to understand the intelligibility of numbers in light of the qualities of which are being quantified by those numbers, right? And then the problem is, unfortunately, though, as to speak very generally, as you move to pure mathematics and you're using math outside of equality, that could be good if you brought it back to equality, like you create math over here and then you discover something that the math applies to, right? That can be fine. But the problem, basically I like to say let me put it this way, all math that can be brought into counting is discovered, but all math that can't be brought into counting is just listing and therefore created, right? Like if you can never bring it into quality, then it is created. But that's the debate. It's not that math is all discovered or all created. It just depends on what math can you bring into the domain of quality. What math can you, and there is some math you can bring to quality, just not all of it. But that itself suggests that intelligibility comes from the vertical. And so this is also what I'm saying. That applies to all relation. Like all intelligibility basically, if intelligibility is not merely listing ideas, it's counting, it's referencing, it's actually referring, then there is a principle of intelligibility that makes the intelligibility possible. That is not just spurious, as Hegel would say. Like, how do you get intelligibility that's true intelligibility versus spurious intelligibility, if you will? Well, because there's something beyond it. There's something vertical that you're referring to that makes it possible. But it's easy to forget that as you do the 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple so quick, it's easy to kind of forget the fact that you're counting quality, that quantity requires quality. And that process of quantification, once you kind of forget the quality, it seems to become more efficient. Because now I can count, like it would be really inefficient to get 900 apples. Like that would be really inefficient, but I want to be able to count to 900. So let's just forget that, I'm counting qualities. And that's when you begin, the efficiency separates you from the quality. Then we get flatness, then we get algorithm, and we leave the quality behind, right? If you could use the number 900 and not forget that that's only going to be intelligible if it's referring to 900 qualities, that would be fine. But there's something about using numbers and algorithms that make you forget their need to ultimately come back to quality, something vertical. And once you forget that, boom, smooth, you're carried along, you're pulled into the satanic, and that's not good. So ultimately then, that also speaks to the need to a deliberate agent, because you need a deliberate agent to deliberate what those numbers are counting, dang it. Like you need to figure out how the thoughts are not just listing, but actually counting qualities, which means you need to deliberate about what quality the numbers and quantification is in reference to. And if you can't do that, then you're stuck in spurious listing. It keeps expanding the choice apparatus. You just keep listing possibilities, and you're dead, and you can't make a choice. You're overwhelmed and you die, and so on and so forth. So you have to have someone able to deliberate the quality that you want all of the horizontal to be in reference to, which means you have to have the ability to value and to determine qualities. And if you don't have that ability, then you might think you're counting, but actually you're just listing spuriously. It's just like spurious choices. It never is going to come back to anything whatsoever. I will throw it to Mr. Jockin here. I do have, because I guess I did want to read this just from Mr. Jockin's paper again. So what is at stake in this contrast is ultimately, so if we're talking about sort of the service brutalism, the algorithmic, this flatness versus the sort of deliberate agent that is able to operate according to the vertical and not end up a starved donkey. This paragraph here is beautiful. What is at stake in this contrast is ultimately teleological. Rather, political order can remain intelligible without reference to final goods. And I'm basically saying that it can't because it ends up listing, not counting, therefore spurious. So that's not good. Or whether the refusal to name ends necessarily results in their covert substitution by procedural and economic surrogates. That's just so pretty. That's just so elegant, Jockin. Come on now. So it gets the simulacra, and the satanic is a simulacra in that sense. And Yeah, because what ends up happening, I guess what I'm saying is intelligibility must be counting. It gets actually switched with listing, and then listing is called counting. You never notice the swap, and you just kind of go along with the procedure, which is listing, next step, next step, next step, next step, and you just kind of go through, and you never kind of ask, yeah, but what is this procedure gathering up? What quality is it bringing together? What is it accounting for, per se? Well, we don't know. Just keep listing. And eventually, once you list to the number 900, then you'll get there. Once you get to the 900th step, you'll get there. No, there's no point that a list becomes counting unless you bring in a quality, unless you bring something vertical into it. There is no amount of listing numbers that turns them into counting unless you introduce a quality that all those numbers share. So it's fundamentally communal as well. It's fundamentally relational. But there's a dream of the political order that seems to be that the more we list, eventually listing will become counting. And if not, you're the problem. The human is what's keeping the listing from being counting, dang it. So get rid of the human, and then the counting will be the algorithm in a self-relating system to itself. And it will be the algorithm will just be counting the algorithm. And that will be the shared quality. And that does seem pretty satanic. But Mr. Jockin.
I mean, shit, Daniel. I mean, wow. Isn't it fun? You just kind of throw a bone, you just throw something out. Like, okay, I got an idea. I'm going to throw it out and see what we do, boys. And then you get dead as first principle, slavery. I mean, that's awesome. That was fantastic. I've had that intuition for a long time, and for both for reasons you both pointed out. I think I'll start with Daniel, because by the way, what you're saying with number applies with language too. A, B, C, D, E, F, G means nothing. But certain letters in a certain arrangement produce certain sounds which connect in their discourse. I know, shout out to Econ knows exactly what I'm talking about. Connect to a certain reality. And especially so when they're in a sentence mode in terms of a proposition, whereas a subject, predicate, and a copula. And notice the copula has to be there. Let alone also even the nature of grammar or language where we need pauses. Things are intelligible only because there are absences too. That's another thing to point out as well. So not only must be a referent, there must be also absences to allow a grounding to even exist in the first place. But again, that's a more abstractional point. I do think this idea, basically, debt is what allowed us to kick the can down the road of the consequences of our political order. It is. Because here's an example. Household income, for example. Most people have, I think the average is about 30, I think it's about 10,000 credit card debt or 30,000. That's the average. But you notice, like, that's the point. People are living on their credit cards to make the difference up to the fact that their income can't make up their living. And that's even beyond the question of what Econ's pointing out too, is that, accounting, like Caleb's channel on YouTube, is basically a moral drama presented to you. This is the human person and their depravity, basically. Almost always is like what gets shown. It's like the person of depravity basically being shown, where they're dysregulated, they don't have harmonized order, and debt is being used as the instrument to allow their satiation of their desire without a reckoning. And normally, almost always, this is also why, by the way, like the language of health is relevant here, financial health, because that's what's going on here, is that just like a bodily health, a bad diet or bad exercise habits generating a crisis of reckoning, where there's a reckoning that has to get mediated, usually with very extreme interventions. Health of the body then applies to health of economics or the finance, and this is how it plays out. And Caleb's channel is just like a moral drama, presenting that to you. Normally it's done for the views of like judging these people, but I think that's actually not the right takeaway from those stories, those videos, by the way. The real story is, look what's allowing them to enter these habitual spaces in the first place. Again, hot take, I can be challenged on this. I see no one coming after debt instruments, personal finance, personal credit card debt, besides like Dave Ramsey. Dave Ramsey's the one I think I've seen who's gone on a mission about it. But besides him, like in general discourse, like, socialists and communists will talk all day, Marxists will all talk about capital, but I don't see anyone talking about credit card debt. Just a comment. I might be wrong. You can show me wrong. Someone put a comment in and show me I'm wrong, where a Marxist did a comment about credit card debt. But at least what I've seen is that's never discussed. But I would actually find that's the most particular and personal and direct contact of the most insidious part of capital is debt in this way. And by the way, like debt is absolutely a nuclear bomb. Yet we treat it like a free, like a candy we give to the 18-year-old. Like, oh, you're a legal adult now. Congratulations, you get a bunch of student credit cards of $2,000. When it really should be considered basically a very dangerous instrument. I say this because compound interest, especially, you're playing with time. That's what you're messing with. You're messing with time. So, under certain calculated judgments, is it reasonable to go into debt? Well, yes. And we just say that with education, for example. If it makes sense. Now, you can make a calculus to justify it, but that's the problem. Actually, look what I just did. I want to point out what I was about to go down with that line of thought. Notice what I just said, with education especially. Now, education has become a optimization of risk management, meaning if I go a certain amount of debt, do I make an income that will justify this debt? But you see that now, so that completely cannibalizes the entire logic of what education was supposed to do in the first place, which is informing of subjects of a certain kind of person, of a certain kind of dispositional state. You understand that now this operation of debt to access education completely shuts down that possibility space because it's unintelligible to the economic space via debt. And that's why spaces with debt are almost always ugly. Why are they ugly? Because beauty is not intelligible to the debt instrument because it's not efficient. Like, you're not going to. I swear to us, I'll put my hand down on a table about this at this point. We will not solve these problems of the beautiful, as I talk about, unless things like debt are addressed explicitly. You will never have a beautiful society, a beautiful spaces, beautiful people, beautiful societies without debt being addressed, because the intelligibility of debt, of the economic transaction and time, you are cut off. This is what I meant by this. So again, this language of the satanic is perfectly justified under this count. You're cut out from God, of the divine when we talk this way, and I'm pointing out the fact that this seems so absolutely Byzantine. This looks absurd. If I talk to people and say, guys, I want to talk about how dangerous debt is. I want to talk about how much it's destroying society, that all our problems are addressed by this debt. And it's on the personal level, let alone the governmental level. Forget that point. I'm not on the personal level, but it applies all the way on all these chains. It's unintelligible. And that's what I meant by, like, that's when we kind of circle back, like the fact that this is outside even the range of even consideration of discourse of what our deliberations are going to be about is very suspicious. It should catch us as very incredibly alarming and suspicious that seems completely alien of even a concept. It seems like it's like me talking about, it actually seems impossible. Isn't that interesting? It seems of the domain of the unreasonably impossible. Because by the way, what is deliberation about from Aristotle? It's about what is possible. It must be in the domain of action and possible. You cannot deliberate on the impossible. This is why choice and wish are not the same. They are the same when it's in the domain of the possible and the be actable. But once they're separated, it becomes wish. Wish becomes, you can wish for being immortal, for example. That's Aristotle's example of this. But isn't that interesting, by the way, actually, with all the discussion of, oh God, what's his name? Brian Johnson's his name or something? That guy on Twitter. He's talking about, like, no, death is a disease that we need a cure. And he's actually trying to take something that is from Aristotle said to be the impossible as wish to pearl it into choice, into proaisis choice now. Isn't that interesting? It's kind of like we've just reverse engineered, we've gone topsy-turvy about the things of deliberation and choice of things that are a wish. It's kind of interesting as a note, just kind of thinking about that. And I say this because notice again, I want to pulse back to the political in the sense of, I usually don't talk about it this way, but yeah, shout out. I see you guys chat in the box about it. Yes, the answer is yes. If we're talking about how we're going to have how we're going to have societies, how we're going to have, I'm sorry, I'm not having a fun, everyone's having a fun blow up in the chat right now, what I'm saying. Our social relation, without this debt point, I think absolutely is this qualification way to impose order on people who do not have virtue in themselves and don't have a soul. And by us, it has no, I mean, look at this. Look how insidious this is. It's invisible. It doesn't have a name, but yet it's acting upon you. This is terms of service brutalism, and it's in all its horror of sublimity of what it's doing, because it basically imposes by you and I. You don't have to name. Look at this. No one's going to argue with the rationality of it, and especially under compound interest. It's perfect. It's just a mechanical. It's just a perfectly logical structure of operation. No one's acting on this. It's just the APR. What do you want me to do? It's the APR, and it's pegged against the federal government. The federal government sets its treasury bonds, and then there you go. And then the bank just has to reasonably just raise their interest rate based on that, treasury, and that's based on collateralized debt assets for that. The uncollateralized, now it's based on risk management. It's basically, well, certain people are not going to pay. We got to make up the money for the difference. Anyways, I want to point out also, I think of a reason I'm bringing about debt, especially compound interest aspects of debt. It's actually even more insidious because the very formal structure of it is based on the interval of time. The compound duration, basically, recycle. I forgot the name, what the formula object is. But basically, the APR, the compounding interest over a year, over a month, over a week, over a day, over an hour, over a minute, you will get more interest generated when that duration of time narrows. So do you see how formally when we talk about the beginning of this conversation about how terms of service brutalism with the removal of friction wants to compress activity down to the smallest interval possible of time duration. Do you see where this is coming from? This is coming from the logical form of debt, of compound interest. It must happen this way by necessity. It must be done, and everything we're doing, we're all just agents of it. And yet we think we have choice and we're actually doing these by our own volition, when in reality we're being dominated by this formal imposition. When the paradigmas from Plato, this is one of the forms being imposed onto us. We're gonna play some cute Platonic stances about this. So yeah, I'm doubling down on this point right now. Because look at this. This is how we're mediating our differences. This is how we're mediating the polarization that's occurring, and the complete dysregulation of persons. We're completely dysregulated. We're basically in moments of psychosis, perversion, or neuroticism, and we have no way to harmonize in communing of families and communities and domiciles and interaction. So as a result, algorithmic spaces, terms of service, arrangements, and debt. Those are almost the triune, basically inverse trinity, basically, if I had to play this kind of language here with everyone here in this room. That's all I got for now. I will stop.
Absolutely magnificent. So there's a few things. So first, I should note that if the distinction between listing and counting requires an identification of the quality, that assumes a person who can judge the quality as similar enough to justify bringing them into the same quantification. So someone who can judge that's an apple versus a pineapple, right? Therefore, the distinction between the listing and counting, and it absolutely applies to language, and I would say all intelligibility, necessarily requires a person, something personal. So therefore, and this would get into my other language, the Gödel point, because the Gödel point would be where you'd have to basically choose how you identify the distinction between listing and counting, would ultimately come to be personal. Now, I'd have to go into detail that, but no need to. So there's a fundamental personal element. Now, basically what I would say is that bad liberalism assumed that there was no birdie and donkey problem that could not be overcome. That any birdie and donkey situation that arose could be overcome somehow, rather it be by removing a pile, rather it be speed, rather it be by, smoothness. You never have to overcome it. This is false. Of course, there is such things as birdie and donkey problems that cannot be overcome other than a deliberate agent. But debt helps you avoid the consequences for being unable to deliberate first principles. And it's basically what we have fallen back on as like, even if all of the other ways we avoid birdie and donkey problems don't work, people don't want things, speed doesn't work, so on and so forth. Body needs of the body don't work. We've got debt. And if, as long as we make it to where you can't get a house without getting into debt, if we make basically it impossible not to be in debt, then that will finally assure that no birdie and donkey situation arises without us being able to deliberate first principles. And that is the kingdom of hell. But anyway, so it's also, it should be noted, economics is always already metaphysical. I like to put the meta in parentheses. Like, you can't separate economics from metaphysics. I'd have to justify that, but you can't. And it is always, therefore, going to be, in its state, in its quality, a testament to how the society processes the metaphysical, if you will, like how it processes metaphysical concerns. Like, you learn a lot by how a society deals with its metaphysics by its economic structures. Because economics always has one foot in the physical and one foot in the spiritual, you can say. It's always in both at the same time. It's almost like the river Styx between them, to use that example, right? So the reality of debt, if we look at it metaphysically, should say something about the situation we are in and why it is problematic. Now, what I want to note is you've made this point that debt brings the future forward, right? Like, you're bringing, so it's a manipulation of time. I would argue with that point is that, so the college example, it's rational to get into college debt, assuming the college degree will be worth something, right? Oh, so you have to assume the space you're in, You have to assume the condition you're in. So basically, it is only rational to bring time from the future into now if the future is not different. You're sacrificing time to space. You're saying space is more real than time. And space-time is false. Time-space is real. Time is more real than space. So you have the great and satanic logic is space-time, where space is more real than time. Divine logic is where time is more real than space, right? So debt necessarily is treating time as if it equals space, because you're taking the time that is supposed to be open and creative and saying, no, I don't want the future to be open and creative. Because if I get into a lot of college debt and college degrees aren't worth anything, I'm screwed. So debt means you don't want the future to be creative and open. You want you want to close what the future could be, right? But here's the funny thing. We find freedom in creativity, in the openness of the future, in the becoming, in the transformation. So if we're closing down the future, because what first principles allow you to do is close your range of choices without closing time. You're able to close your choices while leaving time alone. Like, it's keeping God without turning him into an idol, per se. Like, you know, if I limit my choice range by making God an idol, that's a problem. I need to limit my choice range without making God an idol, without reducing time and creativity and et cetera, so forth, right? Well, debt is basically saying we're going to deal with your inability to reduce choice because you can't deliberate first principles by sacrificing time to space, by wanting the future to be the same as now. So you're removing creative possibility from the future. And that's why it's satanic, because satanic is the sacrificing of time. The logic of the satanic is a limiting of creative possibility. It's a limiting of creativity, a limiting of becoming. And you're basically, debt is only rational if the current conditions are the same in the future. If you get into debt now for X, and the conditions in the future are such that X is no longer a good investment, you're in trouble. So you don't want the future to be different. You want it to be the same. But here's the funny thing. Debt is a prison that makes you want the future to be the same. So you want to stay in prison. So, like, because the condition that made you get into debt will be the same too. So you're literally locking yourself in a prison and hoping the future is not different. Yeah, that's like turning, you know, hell's a point, right? Hell's C.S. Lewis, it's a shrinking. It's a point versus an entire vista. So there is something about debt that is, its metaphysical consequences is it makes us beings of space and now versus being of the creative unfolding. And of course, if beauty is found in the creative unfolding, it necessarily is cutting us off from beauty. If the value of virtue is participating in the surprising, the unfolding, the irreducible, and the fully human, then the logic of debt would necessarily make virtue not worth it. In fact, as you're developing virtue, you're not paying off your debt. You're not practical. You're not doing that thing that makes money. So debt then sets a sort of, debt makes it irrational. Like if you're $100,000, if you're $200,000 in debt and you're reading Plato, have you lost your mind? Like if you're in major debt and you're here having a conversation like this, what are you freaking doing, right? So that's not good. Hell's locked from the inside. Basically also is that like what debt does, yeah, like debt makes it real hard. So you mentioned the Lacanian categories. Yeah, just as a quick note, debt makes the system real freaking hard. Like to deal with debt, you're probably going to end up either in the neurotic, the perverse, where you enjoy the debt and don't care to pay it off. There's an enjoyment in that. You could get into the psychotic, where your debt makes you have what Lacan would say weak speech and you can't interact because you're embarrassed, like because you're in debt. Or you can become neurotic in the sense of you're worshiping the almighty dollar to stay out of debt because the almighty dollar keeps you out of debt, right? So there is something about debt that positions you to either the neurotic, the psychotic, or the perverse, and you never get into a state where you not the real symbolic and the imaginary into drive in the system. No need to go into all of that, but I definitely think debt has psychological consequences. I guess what I want to say as well, and then I have many more notes, but I'll pass it to Econ on anything, is that basically it seems to me that debt is only acceptable if you have a creative people. And what I mean by that is if I get into debt to invest, to build a company, to build an idea, and I'm pulling the future for a creative end, this seems to be okay because I'm literally pulling the future into now to make it open. I'm trying to create something. I'm investing in a creative possibility. I'm getting into debt, taking a risk in order for creativity. So debt for entrepreneurship, debt for creative, new possibilities, et cetera, so forth. Here's the problem. That assumes you have a people who are creative, that you have a school system that is training creativity. And if not, then you're adding debt, which is incredibly dangerous because you're messing with time and giving it to people who basically are doomed to misuse it because they're not creative. Like let me put it this way. Debt would be fine for deliberative agents. Like if you gave debt for deliberative agents would be fine. But the whole reason you're in debt is because you couldn't create deliberative agents, so you made a society of debt to overcome the lack of first principles, which is the lack of deliberative agents. So the likelihood you're gonna, so you got the worst of all possible things. Like debt would be, you could argue debt is dangerous, but it could be used without sacrificing time on the altar of space by deliberative agents. But the modern world has introduced debt in the way that it has, precisely to deal with the problem of deliberate agents. Mr. Jockin.
I'm going to build on this. Your argument about fire, Daniel. Here, go. I want to pass it. Just the fire analogy you used about danger. It's dangerous, but also enables.
Yeah, like with fire can burn you alive, but it also keeps you warm and cook. So it's very important. Like beauty, you need beauty, but it pierces you and can destroy you. God can reduce you to ash, so on and so forth. So debt is very dangerous, and we are now using debt basically for liquidity, not for investment. Like just to keep like liquidity moving, basically to keep the system moving. So you're using debt to stimulate demand versus create demand. Because I think there should be a clear distinction in economics between stimulating demand and creating demand. I'll throw it to Econ here. But basically debt should only be used if you're going to use it for creativity. And that's, we don't have the deliberative agents. And because creativity requires the ability to deal with first principles. Like if you can't deal with first principles, creativity destroys you. It becomes personal expressionism. You end up psychotic. Like you end up in the perverse Lacanian things, right? So creativity really needs the divine. It needs a binding principle. Creativity really needs the vertical. Really needs the vertical. And if you give debt there, then it can be used for creativity. But we've got like the ultimate Satan problem, where you're using the most dangerous things, giving them to people that don't meet the conditions to handle those dangerous things. So these potential sources of increased creativity invert into their opposite and become ultimately destructive, like the highest angel becomes Lucifer. So yeah, I'll throw it to Econ here. Econ.
Oh my Lord. Have mercy. Have mercy. Have mercy. All right. Man, I'm so glad we got this, because not only we got the metaphysical and the ontological, let's go into the economics. First and foremost, let's reference back to Claude Friedrich Bastiat that I'd said earlier. Now, people have to understand this. Back in the day, with like some of the Enlightenment thinkers, because Bastiat is an Enlightenment thinker, although he wouldn't call himself an Enlightenment thinker in the same way that some of the others. I mean, again, he's extremely religious and extremely religious, like far right fundamentalist religious type person, a man after my own soul. He didn't really talk about like personal debt to that extent. Why? Because it wasn't really a big deal. When you and I would have a thing where it'd be like, hey, I want to borrow money. Okay, let's make a contract. Me and you would sit down and deliberate about what the contract is, so that we would both be put in a position that we would know there's not asymmetry of information, there's not the problems of limits or anything like that, because the rule and the law and the contract stood to be very, very specific. Because again, people have to understand, up until 100 years ago, people had a covenantal mindset. So Tocqueville talked about this when it comes to America. Yeah, you've read it. America was based on a covenantal system. Like, America as a republic doesn't make any sense if we don't believe in a covenant. And this is why all of my work that's connected to this in anthropology always runs back into the same stream. So Bastiat does make a lot of arguments against public debt. So I know that Jockin was having this conversation, and yes, in the now, the personal debt is a big problem, because we're now in the same situation that Bastiat was talking about public debt back in the day. Because first, who ultimately pays for the debt? Well, guess what? The way debt's done with bundling, trusts, CDOs, that's not a clear answer. It's not at all a clear answer. Like mortgages, I pay my mortgage, but where is that mortgage at? Okay, so who ultimately pays? We don't know. We seen this in 2008. Who ultimately paid? Well, the government ended up paying. So who paid? Well, now we're back in the problem where, hey, the state spends through taxation. That burden that we see is visible, it's immediate, but when it spends through debt, what do we see? It's displaced in time, it's diffused across the person. So I am now guilty and liable for something someone else did without having any personal interaction in it, and no unity to that person, right? So like the guilt, the liability that we feel as humans for the debt of humanity, that's connected to our unity of humanity. This is not a unity. This is just somebody took on debt, they defaulted, that money has to be paid by somewhere. It's not paid on either end of the contractor, so it's passed off to someone else. That's what value at risk is doing, right? And so debt is plunder, right? So again, he lays this out clearly in the law. And the reason why I was like reading this as we were talking, because I was like, I know Bastiat's done a lot on this. If the law takes from some to give to the others, it's legal plunder. All right. We can all agree with that. So when the government indebts itself, it's literally taking from one to give to another. But there's no giving here, because everybody is bound by it. There's no consent for debt. The payers are people who don't even exist right now. The beneficiaries, they're present and identifiable, but nobody's benefiting because everybody's trapped in the same social system that we've all pointed out. And so because of that, responsibility is dissolved. So if I don't have responsibility, but I have liability, that's where people can go, that's an unjust system. Because debt is the moral illusion, right? Like it's a moral illusion of free goods. Again, let's talk about everything that we just discussed earlier. Oh, well, all these people, they're looking at it. They go, oh, well, I want this new thing. Well, let's put it on a credit card. And I myself do this. But I also am trying to be as aware as possible about what's going on. I set up times, I know it, but most people don't. They just do it. They're just consuming resources now against their future labor. And if that future labor isn't met, then what ends up happening? Again, it just goes out into the system. Nobody chooses these ends. This is a moral problem where people's choices, again, as we've already stated here numerous times, they're reduced. They're reduced to nothingness. We live in a nihilist system, and that debt is just relocating these claims from one place to another without creating anything, which is exactly what you were talking about when you talked about creativity. Now, you were saying creativity requires a first principle. The best book on the subject, by far, in my opinion, now I'm open to interpretation, is Peter M. Sorokin, The Ways and Power of Love. The transformative and creative properties of love. Nothing is as creative as love. I mean, just think about the best poetry you've ever read. It's love. Just think about the best movies you've ever watched. It's love. Just anything that's ever been really good. I mean, if someone gives you a game that's a passion project that they loved, you know it's going to be good. Why do modern AAA games suck? There's no love. It's like completely like opted out of love. Like there's no love for the game. Michael Jordan was the best basketball player because he loved the game. I mean, it makes no sense. And when it comes to entrepreneurship, I mean, why would you be an entrepreneur when there's such a big cost reference to being an entrepreneur unless you love it? And that's why most small businesses fail, except for one where people really love it. And I think, again, so if creativity has to have a first principle, it's love, and God is love, John. So I think that counts. And another point is risk. We keep talking about risk, but I don't think people have any clue what risk is. I mean, modern academics, I don't think they have a sliver of understanding of what risk is. So you talked about danger. I'm glad you did. So there's a book by Niklas Luhmann. It's called Risk, a Sociological Perspective. It's by far one of the best books on risk. Now, he starts off the book, he's like, okay, we're going to take a historical analysis of risk. Okay, so when does risk become a word? Well, risk is always, was a synonym for danger. But when did risk become a different word? Because no one was like, oh, we're at risk. Like that would never have made sense. There's danger, it's an immediate thing, or there's everything is fine. You don't read, 1500, 1600 literature where they're like, we are at risk of war. They're saying we're going to have war or we're not. And so what's ended up happening is as we've moved through, and he makes a whole lot of arguments about time. This is actually, these arguments about time is actually one of the things that got me and Trey to become close. I love him and he loves me. I give him a hard time. But one of the things we were talking about love is about circular causality, right? Or not love, talking about time is circular causality. And people are like, people really don't understand circular causality. But circular causality makes perfect sense when we think about risk, because risk is something that impacts future decisions based on our past behavior. So that's circular in and of itself. Like the causal mechanism of the future defines what happens in the present, and the present is defined by the past. And then also when we look back and we think of the past, that's also caused by the future, right? So there is circular causality, and he makes these distinctions between the present past and the past present, and he makes distinctions between the present future and the future present, right? Because we have to like disaggregate and break apart what is being done here, and risk is a part of this present future, if I remember correctly. I'll double check this. Has been a minute, but basically we see danger as a presence and an immediacy, but future obligations and things of that nature, those don't actually exist in us. They're only causal without being an agent per se. By that I mean by an essence, but they're caused by an agent, which would be us, but they're not per se because they're entirely extrinsic to us, but they're a part of us. And so all of this wraps back around because, again, I'm going to sound like the satanic panic here. The satanic panic wasn't wrong. If you want to see what present, future, and risk tolerance and risk avoidance looks like, the satanic panic is probably the number one thing. Because just think about it at the time. I grew up in the satanic panic. Yeah, both of y'all grew up in the satanic panic. It was really weird. It was really annoying, right? Like everything was satanic. Everybody was mad about everything. Like it's like, oh, you playing Magic the Gathering? Oh, Satan! You're playing Pokemon? Satan! You're watching Harry Potter? Satan! But what ended up happening 20 years later? Like, just take a hard look at things. Look at Harry Potter fandom 20 years later. It's the biggest amalgamation of Satanism you could possibly imagine. Like Satanic Panic had a lot of things right, and that's why I know it's like crazy. It's like, oh well, you just yelling at everything and calling it satanic, and oh, you're trying to box it into your metaphysical frame. But no, seriously, just think about it for a moment. It's the inversion of everything traditional. And again, wrap this back around to neocons. Neocons have consistently over and over inverted what are the primary principles of conservatives. They don't care about stewardship. I'm a conservative. I love Mother Nature or Sister Earth or whatever you want to call her. I want to preserve her as much as any wild liberal and progressive ever does. But the fact that there are conservatives out there that's like, I don't care if all these animals go extinct, just blows my absolute mind. Like, what are you doing? What are you conserving? You're not doing a conservation of nature, so you're not conserving that. You're not doing a conservation of personhood because you're straddling everyone with debt, and anyone who tries to fight out of it, well, you just call them a progressive or a liberal or a Nazi. And it's just like, okay, so now I can't do that. I can't preserve my tradition and culture. I can't preserve what I want. So what is being conserved? It's absolutely nothing. And you know what? I never even thought about this until we had this conversation. That debt is probably the number one leading cause of all of this. Because now that you've made me think about this so much more, Jockin, like seriously, think about it. Why does terms of service brutalism matter? Because of debt. You named it. You nailed it. It's the shortening of that time period. Because guess what? We have to figure out a way to compress the present future and the future present into the present. Because as long as we can remove the risk, because it's not a danger, and value at risk is the primary thing at issue, then guess what? I don't have to bear consequences personally. And that's literally the definition of Satanism, is to not bear consequences personally, not being repentful, not paying penance, not having voluntary exchange, no consent. Nobody can judge the risk because it's dispersed everywhere. People are bound, and they've never consented to a single thing that they're bound to. They can't opt out. Why can't we opt out? And my grandkids are going to be straddled with debt. They don't even exist yet. So there's no moral agents in this. We're just instruments of the managerial right. And that was my video, and that's been everything that I've gathered here. And I think the managerial right, what I personally think now, I think I'm going to make another video when I talk about the managerial right. I'm going to call them the debt collectors. And I guess I'll be a Pharisees. But anyway.
Oh, that's delightful. Gentlemen, alas, I'll have to go here in a minute, but we can do more round because I've enjoyed this immensely. So there's a few things. So first, now I'm thinking, I think it's very important to make a distinction between risk and danger. And there's something about risk that requires, like, it makes me think of William Ong, where reading creates an inner space where you can make a break between response and reaction, kind of cognition for Viktor Frankl, right? Like you can internalize, like risk requires some sort of internal space of consideration, right? If it's going to be distinct from danger. Well, as debt is incredibly bad to give to people who can't be deliberate agents without first principles, so risk is really bad to give to people who can't do that, because risk is a fundamentally more metaphysical phenomenon. It is a time binding. It is a relation to time. And if you don't have an internal space, and risk is fundamentally that of which requires an internal space, people aren't going to be able to manage risk, so the system will manage risk. Like, risk becomes something you manage versus something you deliberate over. And the whole thing becomes about risk and debt, which are like, I get belt like Legion and Beelzebub or something. Like, these are like the forces of the satanic. Like, so it's like, and they're like unleashing risk and debt, we are Legion, upon people without internal space, when these two things fundamentally require internal space, is a recipe for disaster. I think also I'm now thinking about what should conservatism conserve? Friction. It should conserve the friction against the smoothness. It should conserve that of which forces you to develop an inner space. Like, what conservatism should conserve is that of which is what you need for the development of an internal space. Because if there's a sense in which debt is with us, risk is with us, then either we get rid of it, which may have massive who knows what that would do. That could be a top-down thing with unintended consequences or whatever. So there's always that idea of, Jesus on the cross, which is the victory of Satan, turns out to be his greatest defeat. Right? Like, you invert the inversion. So what would it mean to right now invert the inversion of debt and risk? It would be to bring back the internal space, which then, if deliberate actors can actually take things like debt and risk and make a more creative and becoming world, a more dynamic world, it would be Satan's greatest victory becomes his greatest defeat, right? Like, it would reverse that sort of thing. So I'm thinking about conservatives conserving that of which is needed for the development of the internal space. And, as you were also talking about debt, yeah, there's a sense in which it's all child sacrifice, right? It's all Moloch. Like, debt means we sacrifice the future. There's two ways you sacrifice. We either sacrifice the future with our debts, or we have an economic crisis that calls a war, and we sacrifice our children on the battlefield. So basically, it's all child sacrifice. And I'm also thinking that's interesting about that is debt creates relation without relationship. Like, you have a relation to the future, but there's no person. So it's all algorithmic. So the reason why the satanic is when there's a relation, notably between people, without relationship, right? And so, like, there's a relation without relationship, and that creates the Moloch dynamic, where the children are being eaten. I think what I'll also say here, yeah, so we have a metaphysics of relation without relationship, space-time versus relationship, time-space. And yeah, everyone, I talk about that all the time, where it's not Einstein, it's Bergson and stuff. But anyway, it should be time-space. Time is not relative to space. That's been a disaster. Space is an expression of time. Time is real. It's becoming, etc. There is a way where love is the opposite of debt, right? Like, when you love someone, they're not indebted to you. Love is grace, so it would make sense that love is the creative principle that is divine, where debt is satanic. And a great satanic inversion is love equals debt. I love you, so you owe me. That's when you're in hell, right? Like, the lover does not say you owe me. The lover says, grace, you owe me nothing. And it's a covenant. Love is a covenant, not a debt, right? There's a difference between a covenant and a debt. Like, a covenant is a sort of trust and an open process that gives forth beauty. And so love is the opposite of debt. And love is ultimately creative, because in love, you get this creative unfolding. So basically, we have an age of debt instead of love. So it would make sense that the world's on fire and everyone's angry and there's no love, because they're all in debt. So they're under a habitus of a metaphysics of space-time that necessarily is satanic and the opposite of love, and it's child sacrifice. So yeah, everyone's upset because the kids are being sacrificed, and we don't know how to stop it because we have to pay our mortgage. And that's not good. You shouldn't have to sacrifice kids to pay your mortgages, everyone. I think we can do better. I think, like, here, it's also, I'll read this, and then I'll throw it to Jockin. I love this paragraph in the conclusion. A political order that refuses to acknowledge final goods does not thereby remain impartial. I think what we're discussing is it ends up with a logic of debt. Instead, it substitutes optimization for judgment and automation for formation. What it cannot name, it manages. What it cannot form, it regulates. In the absence of shared ends, freedom is reduced to compliance with systems designed to decide in advance what will count as reasonable. I love this paragraph. And what we are suggesting is that debt is the kind of the fail-safe, the layer and operation of all of this that keeps it going, that is satanic in its caricature. So if one wants to say the system is impartial, then one is ignoring the child sacrifice. And I think we need to stop ignoring the child sacrifice. Mr. Jockin and then Econ, and then forgive me for having to go. Mr. Jockin.
I have to agree with Econ's comment. I mean, that was a tour de force of conclusion right there. I want to just add one last note. By the way, you talk about the either child sacrifice of the future of children or a war now. Guys, this whole point about what Econ's saying about the debt basically being abstracted out into the government and then basically abdicated from responsibility. By the way, I lectured about this about design ethics. This is how design ethics works, because there's no individual actually doing the design objects, just whole infrastructures and processes. So no one's responsible for the actual failures. That's also where my term of service brutalism came from, was from this observation of design ethics, where there's no responsibility because it's been abstracted out into a process. Here's a note about financial instruments when this happens. I've seen, I could be challenged on this. One account has been that one of the results of the federal government, the United States government, taking on the debt it's doing from the 2008 and onward, and even especially with COVID more recently with the COVID debt absorption, that the crises in third world and other countries like Sri Lanka and Egypt were directly as a result of externality of the consequences of the debt obligation. So thus, we did not pay the price for it. Quite frankly, brown people in third world countries did instead. That was the ones who actually paid the price. So I just want to point out that this property of external externalities of addressment of risk doesn't even get played out. It can be played out either in time with our children in the future and future generations, or in space of other cultures and bodies having to pay the price. Because now their gasoline explodes in price, or their bread, they can't get their food because their bread now is incredibly expensive, their grain prices, for example. I'm sure there's lots of other examples too. Those just two came to my mind. They kind of flush this point. Also, I want to just comment again, this note of relation without relationship is exactly on the mark. That is precisely the problem. That is why we have this horror of nihilism. How are we so connected yet all alone? That's like the great question of the modern period of technology and digital spaces. Why are they algorithmic? Why are they not geopitic? This is the point. This is what you get, you seem to have this relationship, but there's no relation. There's no ship. There's no ship, there's just relation. This is excellent. And debt is the instrument of which all this operates. And by the way, there's been a lot of discussion in the design history. It has not been written yet, but I know it will be. It should be. The explosion of the startup culture and design culture that came with it in the 2000s, 2010s especially, 2010s period especially, it was because of what happened in 2008, the debt crisis. From that, startups were the only space that capital was able to get a return on the capital as far better than housing and mortgages. So the entire design industry was capitulated as an instrument of debt to produce assets of value, which then would build these startups for the purpose of purely being acquired, the exit event, to get their return on their investment, their 10x rule. This is, I think, again, another pointing out of how the debt is this instrument. I am so grateful that this proposition I had that I felt like I've been saying for people and it just never landed, because people go, what of it? It's just how life is, just what it is. It is what it is. You gentlemen are seeing this in the full ramification of its signification of the ontological reality of our times and how basically we must think this. We're not going to get the geopaedic. We're not going to get beauty the way that my interest in the project of it unless we address these points. We have to invert it. It must be a addressment of it in a way to fully acknowledge its reality, but not be defeated by it. We cannot allow this to be a defeat of like, this is just how society is. This is how it's going to go. Otherwise, what's the point of us talking? There's no point if we just conclude this is the end point. With that said, I think, Daniel, your point on that, I'll try to close the loop to our original discussion. Creation of the inner space is that gap between desire and action. That's the inner space where judgment and memory must reside. That is what this project is about. This is on the personal level. And by the way, actually, then applying that, what's the scale of that into persons? Is that basically when you talk about this idea of love, it's a covenant, it's not debt. That's exactly the point. Our commitment to one another. Have a debt to one another of commitment, in that sense of relationship with each other. That would be the kind of, could we not agree that what we're doing here with three of us is kind of an example of that, right? In a sense that we're all committed with our individual projects, but we know we're working together. We're coming to insights we couldn't do otherwise, which is the exact opposite of the academic space where this is impossible. There is no way for this to be happening in the academic space because all the structures and incentives of it don't allow it. How can it? The velocity of the motion and movements don't allow for this kind of pausing Scholé. Kind of shout out to my colleague Johannes. The emphasis of Scholé is in exactly this point. We need the breathing space of internal space to think through together, the real revelation. I mean, another toy example, actually, with an example of it, my colleagues in the art and music department, we got together for dinner this past weekend. Like we had a dinner together with the wives, came and all that. It was good. You know what's funny? Everyone came up with the insight of like, oh, you know what we should do? We should plan, like we came up with this idea of, we basically insight of a bus trip to New York City for both music and art. Like we went to the museum and everyone got very animated, very excited about it. And it was funny. Someone said, so funny. Why didn't we think of this when we saw each other in the office? I was like, guys, you understand why that is? You needed to have a pause space, like think through, to have this opportunity to show up of thought, to be able to get us to get animated about it. If we were in the class or in our offices, what time? Where are we going to do this? Where is this going to happen? So I do think these small steps, but it's not neither just an individual problem. This is a cultural, social problem. And that's the point, is that this discussion of debt is to show you this. Debt is normally discussed as a personal crisis failure, of a moral failure of the individual, and there's certainly legitimacy at this point. But nevertheless, it doesn't change the fact that the entire social relation and political relation is based on this debt structure. So thus, this transcends the typical conservative progressive distinction of personal responsibility versus societal obligation. It transcends that because it shows that it penetrates on both vectors and both elements of it. It's fantastic. It's a tour de force of a conversation. I'm very thankful for it, and I'm very thankful to call you both my friends in virtue.
I feel exactly the same way. I'll throw it to Econ here. What I would say is that the true new political revolution in metaphysical terms will treat time as more real than space. The problem is both options now are sacrificing time to space per se. They're not honoring time. They're therefore sacrificing children. Also, basically, it is inevitable that without deliberative agents, debt is always going to be paid in blood. There is no way to pay debt with anything but blood unless you have deliberative agents. And yet the entire reason I would argue we now have debt is to deal with the problem of not having deliberative agents, which is basically giving fire to children. No wonder we're all getting burned. I'm also now thinking on this point with Silicon Valley is debt goes to the startups for the algorithm that becomes the AI that is the transhumanist movement, right? So there's an issue here where even if debt goes to creativity, if that creativity is concentrated in a given area, it can't spread through the entire society because the conditions of personhood for that kind of thing is not there, then the creativity inverts, right? Because like love has to be spread, love has to be shared, right? And it actually then can invert into idolatry, if you will. And I don't think it's by chance that, yeah, debt has primarily gone into technology that is now basically giving us the algorithm that's making us lose our humanity, that then goes into the Nick Land AI and all that different stuff. Because you could argue too that a lot of the startup culture were not, this would be a claim, were not necessarily people who could deliberate first principles. So you had creativity that went to people who could then engineer, but even that creativity itself must be mediated in love, or it actually will just be in service of, it's not really an innovation. It's just the logic that's actually already there of the horizontal without the vertical in a new form. So in that sense, it's actually not creative. It's an appearance of creativity because you must be able to deal with the vertical. So debt is very metaphysical. Debt is the air that one breathes that determines how metaphysics operate in the society. And I fear it is basically the sacrifice of time. And what are relationships but unfolding through time? Like that, like a relation is atemporal, but relationships are only known in their fullness through the time in which they unfold and unveil what they fully are. So you cannot have relationships without time, without encounter, without surprise, and without the willingness to meet the other person. But to handle the other person, you need an inner space. Now, of course, the danger of the inner space is that's where you find the Lacanian real. That's where you have to face yourself. The inner space is a journey. It is difficult. There is real danger in the inner space. And so it would be rational to smooth it out and get rid of it, right? To just make everything algorithmic. The conservative conserves the inner space. The conservative conserves the inner space, even though it's quote unquote rational to get rid of it because it's scary, because you don't know what you'll find there. And you have to wrestle with yourself and you have to ask deep metaphysical questions that are not necessarily easy to figure out. We do not conserve that, though, we cannot be deliberative agents, and risk and debt will indeed prove legion. I will throw it to Econ here, and I've enjoyed this immensely. Econ, please.
Hey, thank you, everyone. I just want to say that I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's definitely given me something to walk away with, and definitely something to, further unpack in my own work, especially when it comes to this conserving the inner space, because it requires an inner space for the conservative to conserve. And I know that a lot of people would probably hear that and think it's a tautology, but again, something that's important in psychology, especially from a religious perspective, is we have to understand that there's a difference between the inner man and the outer man, such as like orthodoxy. It's very clear that we have to hold to this understanding and break it out, right? And then, technology as the end of what it is to be a human. I was reading a book by Kingsnorth. I've been reading it. There's a discussion for this. I am on the side of technology as an amoral thing that requires humanity to be a thing. And this is actually my work on what's called the theory of requisite virtue, which is something that we can unpack another day. But essentially, it's that all the actions that a system has, whether it's AI, humans, whatever, anything that is a rational actor, a deliberative agent, requires virtue to be properly acting. Right. I think Jockin's gone over some of my stuff in this realm. It's a very strange topic because it goes against the very grain of modern anthropology, that man is not an empty shell and man is not also a determined object. It's somewhere in between. It's the golden road. And we don't hold and we don't have virtue by ourselves. It's not something that we have. It's not an essential characteristic of man to be virtuous. That's what people fail to realize. They think that I can be virtuous. You can't. You can only be virtuous by participating in what has virtue. Now, man has the capacity for virtue in so much as it is grace. And that's where the breakout happens, and that's where the differences come down. But so when we talk about the problems of technology and when we talk about the problems of debt and how these are leading humans to not be human, really what we're saying, and this is the most clear way to think about it, we aren't humans because we stop being the image and likeness of God, because God made humans to be the image and likeness of God. The moment we stopped being the image and likeness of God, we stopped being human. And everything that drags us away from that is satanic. That is satanic. Technology, when used, misused in its proper form, is satanic. Debt has its positive attributes. Technology has its proper attributes. Those can only be proper insofar as a virtuous people and a virtuous man can use them. And if anything, to figure out how we fix the world, how we save it, everybody needs to start being virtuous. And you can only be virtuous by participating in that which has virtue. And that would be the first principle. So you're either crap or get off the pot, because one way or another, you're going up or down. And stop sacrificing kids.
Stop sacrificing kids. That's magnificent. As you're speaking, and that was wonderful. And again, gentlemen, I've enjoyed this immensely. I don't know where the time went. I think there's something like with technology, there's something that I almost want to say it seems as if everything amoral, in a sense, or that is neither moral nor good, like technology, like a bothness or something like that. Without deliberate agents, it eventually becomes demonic through probability. Like, so what I almost want to say is that debt, risk, and technology are not necessarily quote unquote satanic, but as they move through the system, kind of cybernetically, that, and this would apply to anything that's either or. Anything that is either or toward the divine, toward the satanic, if it moves through a system over enough time, if there is not a sufficient amount of deliberate agents to move it toward the vertical, then it will become satanic. And that's almost what it seems to be. Like that, it's not, because everything that's created, you know, there's nothing that's essentially evil, say in a Christian idea, right? It would be like it's out of order or whatever. But if it goes through, it's almost like this. Everything that goes through history, that goes through time, that is not in a sense sufficiently honored by deliberate agents to keep it open, therefore come to in their being sacrifice time to space, stagnancy, and therefore fall into the logic of the demonic. So basically, this means that even though nothing is necessarily evil, quote unquote, if humans are not active, deliberate agents, then everything will become satanic. It will all become it eventually. Not because it necessarily had to, but because in a system through time of a insufficient amount of deliberate agents, it will. Not necessarily, but because it will. And that's for me how to kind of think about this, because it's not a necessity, that an unconditional necessity. It's a necessity by probability due to an insufficient amount of virtue and deliberate agents and different things. I will think more on that. Mr. Jockin, it's been a treat, sir. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed it. Econ, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Have a good evening, sir.